Is there anything that you would like me to go through in terms of tools that I might miss? Because otherwise I'm going to talk about like things that I think is good. But if you have like specific things that you might want me to cover, then do let me know, because they would be really useful. I think someone was asking like what is expected of a tool developer as opposed to a like gameplay programmer, or a regular programmer, whatever that is at a game studio. So I mean, a tool developer in general is not really going to work on the code that's in the game, but rather work on the code that's for the developers, to assist the developers in the creation of their stuff, right? To make, add some importing scripts to make sure that whatever meshes you're importing into the project, to make sure that those are clean, maybe do some verifications on those. Maybe have this like custom setup where you're writing vertex colors through code or something. Like there's a lot of stuff that you can do that, like given, specific demands that certain projects has, then it might be really useful to have some custom code that would solve those problems automatically. There's also all sorts of stuff in terms of like, what if you want to add a feature to Unity that just doesn't exist? Maybe maybe you want to make a like grid or something that you can like position and place somewhere and then snap objects to that grid. Like that doesn't exist in Unity, but you can make it exist in case, that's something that you really need for the project. So I think what's expected of tool developers is to really work on the tools for the other developers. I think it's especially important. For tool developers to sort of have an understanding of who's going to use their tools. Like when you're making a game, your quote unquote customers, I guess, or your users are players, right? As a tool developer, your users are game developers, and you need to sort of think about like, okay, what are the needs of the game developers? What do they know? Like if you're making tools for a level designer, then making your tools like super programmer centric is probably a bad idea, right? So there's a lot of like design that goes into tools as well. Like how do you use the tool and what's the most intuitive way for someone who doesn't know your code to use this tool, right? So I think what we're going to talk about throughout this course is various tool-like things you can do and like actual tools you can implement. There are sort of like halfway steps you can take to make things more intuitive for a level designer. And also like doing like proper full-on tools where you have a separate window for your stuff in Unity that has some specialized functionality, right? And you can do a lot with this. You can do almost anything, right? Like back in the days, I made ShaderForge for Unity, and that's a plugin. And I'm going to talk about things that I used when making ShaderForge, right? So all of this is like, it's possible to do all of this, and it doesn't require any like weird DLLs or external plugin shenanigans. You can actually do all of it in C#, which is really cool. Do you want us to code along with you, or do you want to do it at your own pace? I was thinking I would mostly talk about stuff this first lecture, and then the first week it's probably mostly going to be lectures, and then the second week is probably mostly going to be exercises. I think that's an okay setup. So I thought I'd go through sort of like from the very basics of tool development and then go to a more advanced tool to talk about, kind of an iterative process of making your code more useful for people who use Unity, such as level designers, which is a very common case. And then going from there to making an entirely new tool in Unity. So I think that would be a good start. There we go. Okay, so just as an example, so one very common use case is that you have some mod behaviors in your game, which you generally do. And then these mod behaviors have a bunch of properties, right? So say you have this like explosive barrel script. You might have a radius for how far that should go. You might have a number for how much damage it should do. Like there are a lot of stuff that you could have in a script like this, right? Maybe you could have some more attributes. Color has to be red by default, right? All right, so just having those properties and then adding your code and adding all the functionality to your thing, that's kind of the bare minimum of making an object like this, right? So if you go here, maybe we should add a capsule to this. Actually, there's a cylinder. I always forget that that's a thing. There we go. Here's our explosive barrel. Probably should make it more. It's a barrel shape. There we go. Okay, so now we have this script of explosive barrel, right? And we can add this to the object, and you know, it's sort of, we have all the information we quote unquote need in order to set up an explosive barrel, right? We can set the radius, we can set the damage, we can set the color of it, although we haven't implemented it, but that's fine. So there are a lot of things we can do to make things easier for the level designer, right? So always think of, instead of thinking of you making something for players, you're making something for level designers. So imagine someone using Unity and they're placing, you know, these explosive barrels in the level, then one thing that's going to come up almost immediately is that, well, we can set this radius, but we can't see what the radius actually is, right? Like, what is the radius, like, visually? Because that might really matter in, you know, setting up the levels. So this is where, you know, it's kind of your job as a tool developer to make that more intuitive and make that more useful so that you can sort of like speed up the entire development process for all of your team, right? That's kind of your top priority as a tool developer, right? And there are many like very simple things you can do where you don't really have to go into making editor scripts and whatnot. So some of the things that I like to do is use the attributes in Unity for this. So for instance, you have this radius thing. Right now you can like set it to negative values, which is kind of weird. And you're probably never ever going to want like an explosive barrel that has a radius like above 20, right? So we could actually use attributes for this. And Unity has a few like really useful built-in attributes. So there's one called range, where you can turn a property into a slider. So in this case, we might want to make a range from, say, 1 meter to 8 meters or something. So just by adding this attribute to this property, or to this field, then if we go back to Unity and recompile, there's now a slider here. So now we've like sort of immediately made this, you know, both more intuitive because it's kind of nice to have a slider. And then also you've like made it foolproof, right? There's no way a user can set this to an invalid value, right? Which is very, very useful because if you're working on a project long-term, like making sure that level designers can't make mistakes, or at the very least having scripts that can like clean up mistakes and whatnot, that stuff is incredibly useful, especially as your project scales. So that stuff is kind of important to think about in general. Because I think it's important to consider that like, as your project grows, you're adding more and more code to it, adding more and more functionality to it, right? And if you have this, like, even if you have something that might seem very simple, of like, every time you add something to a level, you need to press this button and then press this button. Even something that might seem simple like that, that's quite a lot of overhead for a level designer to always have to remember. And then there's overhead in, you know, someone new joining the project who needs to be taught all of these like quirks you've sort of added to the project, right? So I think it's really important to think about, you know, what is the workload that we're adding and what is the workload that we're alleviating by whatever it is we're doing, right? Yeah, so it's important to consider that. Okay, so what would be the next step of making this more intuitive? Well, one of the things we should do is, again, visualize the radius, right? Because now it was just kind of anonymously a number, and there was no way to tell in the scene view what is the actual size of this thing. So there are two very useful functions they can use. There's onDraw Gizmos and onDraw Gizmos selected. This is kind of like sort of like an update loop in the editor where you can draw to the scene. And it's generally gizmos that you're drawing. So if you toggle gizmos in the top right, it would also toggle this function being run. And if you turn off the gizmos for a specific script, then onDraw Gizmos for those scripts would also not run, right? So in here, you can do a lot of different things to visualize whatever you want, pretty much. So in this case, we want to display a radius, right? So to do that, we can either use stuff in Gizmos. So Gizmos has a lot of like draw cube, draw icon, draw line and stuff. And so in this case, we could do draw wire sphere. That's kind of like a wireframe sphere. It will draw like 3 circles. Okay, so what does this want? This one wants a center and a radius. So the center would be the position of this object, right? Transform dot position. And then we would have the radius of this explosive barrel, right? Or the radius of the explosion, rather. So just by adding this now, if we go back to Unity and recompiling, we now have this marker in the editor. So we can move these barrels around, and now we actually visually see what the radius actually is of this explosive barrel, right? And if we tweak this radius, we can see that it's, you know, updating and staying up to date with the value of the radius, right? And it might seem like a very simple thing, but the amount of value that this gives to level designers is like massive. And it doesn't require a whole lot of code. This is a tiny amount of code, just adding a range and adding this gizmo. So don't underestimate the value of this stuff. And in this case, I switched the function out to the onDraw gizmo selected, in which case it will only draw when you select stuff, which might be useful because the gizmos are not free to draw. You can actually reach a state where you have a big level for your game, and you end up having a terrible frame rate in the editor because you have so many gizmos being drawn. So it can be useful sometimes to only draw them if you select the object, otherwise it becomes chaotic. But you can still multi-select in case you want to see multiple radii and so forth. Alright, so it can be useful for stuff that's not only marking, the radius of something. You can do pretty much anything you want with this. And one thing that I've found can be really useful is quite often you have managers in your scripts, right? So I'm just going to show one more example of gizmos, and also a really neat design pattern, I guess it's called. I don't know design patterns, but there's a pattern in Unity that I really like and very much recommend. Let's say you have an explosive barrel manager. Let's say you need to manage them from some central place, right? Let's create that object. Sometimes it's useful to label your stuff with the icons up here. So you can click one of these icons and it'll be visible in the scene view. It can be a neat little thing for managers like this that don't really have a visual element to it. All right, so let's say we have this explosive barrel manager. And we want this one to sort of be aware of all of the explosive barrels in the game, right? And there are many ways we can sort of set this up. How do we want this one to find all the explosive barrels, right? How does it populate, say, a list of explosive barrels, right? And there is a really nice pattern that I like to use a lot because you can very easily make this pattern work both in editor and in game. So one thing that I really like to do is to have a static list. So this is going to be sort of like a singleton. We only have one explosive barrel manager, and this one is going to keep track of all of the explosive barrels. So in this case, we have a list of all the barrels, and we're going to initialize that. And then in the explosive barrel script, we're going to do void onEnable. And in onEnable, we're going to do explosive barrel manager dot all the barrels, which is not public. And then we're going to add this. So it's basically adding itself in onEnable to the list of all the barrels, right? Excuse me, my throat is still very sad. Might be the corona. It's hit me. Hello, Thor. And then in on disable, we're going to remove itself from the list. And this pattern I use absolutely everywhere. I use this in so many different things, and it's been really, really useful. Also, I usually like to use expression embodied members as well, because then you can like pack them really nicely. So what this does is that as soon as this object is enabled, it's going to add itself to the list. As soon as it's disabled, it's going to remove itself from the list. The really nice thing about this pattern is that if you toggle an object in Unity, if you enable or disable an object, it's quote unquote going to automatically be added and removed from that list as soon as it happens. So this is like the one pattern that I always advocate for when using Unity, because yeah, it's super useful. And like it handles everything in terms of lifetime, even like destroying objects and like doing assembly reloads, which we're going to talk a little bit about later as well. Okay, so now we have this this list of all the barrels, right? Yeah, so then in this script, we can then do another onDraw Gizmos, because this is, again, it's also an object in the world, right? Then we might want to, draw a line from the manager to all the explosive barrels, because then you can see sort of, where are all the barrels in the scene, and then by selecting this object, we can make this one point to every single barrel, right? So we could do stuff like Gizmos dot draw a line. I cannot type. So you can do Gizmos dot draw line, and then want to draw. Actually, we need a for loop first. So for each explosive barrel in all the barrels, we're going to draw a line from transformed opposition to barrel dot transformed opposition. That does not work. And the reason this doesn't work is because if we go to explosive barrel, onEnable and onDisable are only called when you start the game, right? So if you hit play in the editor, starts the game, and then we come back to the scene view, and now it works. Now this list is populated, right? Because now all the onEnable has been called in all of these barrels, and now it's in it. And it's, when we're in game, all of these functions are going to call. So if I disable one of these barrels, it's going to get disconnected, right? Because now I disable the script. If I disable the object, it's also going to get disabled. If I delete the object, it's also still going to work. Like there's no null reference exceptions here because we're using onEnable, onDisable, that ties into Unity's, pipeline in terms of object lifetime, which is really, really useful. Okay, so but what we really wanted is to also do this in the editor, right? So there's a very, very useful attribute that you sort of have to use with care because you can mess things up royally if you don't use this carefully. What did you do to make the line appear? I pressed play, I started the game, and then went back to the scene view. So when the game is running, onEnable and onDisable is going to get called, right? So there's an attribute that's kind of dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, so be careful. But there is an attribute called ExecuteAlways. So you can add this one to your mono behaviors. And what's going to happen is that all the functions you have is also going to be called in the editor. So it's kind of like whenever you mark something as ExecuteAlways, it's sort of like the game is already running for those objects, right? So what that means is that these functions will now also run in the editor. So if we go back to Unity now, recompile, we now see these lines. Even though we haven't started the game is not running, but these functions were called anyway. And that's because of the ExecuteAlways attribute. So what this means is that you can actually, you can add an update loop, and then this will also happen in the editor. So that's why you kind of need to be careful with this. Yeah. Won't this make the onEnable be called when you select and deselect the objects? No, it won't. you might be thinking of making custom inspectors because they get on enable and on disable called when you select objects. But selection doesn't really affect this. So it's only when the script is, on enable is when the object is instantiated, and enable, like Leon is saying. So yeah, this will still now work in the editor like it did in game. We can toggle these objects, right? And it's still going to be added or removed to the list. Sort of exactly as we expect them to do, right? How about execute in edit mode? That's a deprecated tag. So it's whatever, execute always is what execute in edit mode used to be. I think it's because execute always has some parameters, if I remember correctly. No, never mind. I think there was some behavior that execute in edit mode had that had a bunch of issues. I think it might have been related to instantiating objects in onDestroy or something, which I think they changed the behavior of for when execute always. So you might see that as execute in edit mode in tutorials, but for later versions of Unity, I'm pretty sure you should use execute always. Yeah. Okay. And then, because I care a lot about making things pretty, there is another function. There's another like class you can use to. There's another class you can use for drawing stuff like this. So Unity usually uses Gizmos or one called handles. So handles is generally to make handles in the editor where you can like drag stuff around. But in this case, I'm going to use this just to draw lines because there is a really useful function here that is called draw anti-aliased polyline. So this is kind of, if you want to draw a line that has anti-aliasing, then I recommend using this one instead. Because it looks much prettier, and I'm sad when I look at non-anti-alias lines. So now they look much better. Not that you probably can tell a difference on stream, but but yeah. So I quite often use this one. It's really useful. Yeah. One thing that you need to be careful with though, whenever you use handles, handles is an editor-only class. So you can't actually like build the game if you just if you have this code in your project just straight up. So something that you're going to have to do a lot in like in dev environment, if you're making a lot of builds, then you're going to need to preprocessor define out some code, right? So in this case, it included it says using Unity editor at the top, right? And this one is, you can't use this once you make a build of the game. So there's a preprocessor command that you can use. That's called if Unity editor. This one is very useful for many reasons, especially if you have stuff like, you might have a lot of asserts that make sure that things are working fine or whatever, or you might have some extra code for debugging. You can exclude that using this preprocessor define. So basically, when you make a build, it's going to remove everything inside of if Unity editor. So in this case, we would also have to do that with any handles function as well. But we might as well do it for the entire onDraw Gizmos function. So yeah, otherwise you generally bump into this quite a lot where you're like, you've written a bunch of code, then you try to make a build, and then every single place you've used handles, it's just going to fail and you're going to have to fix all of that code. Yeah. So that's a very, very useful thing. So handles and Gizmos has a bunch of like super useful functions. I think there's even like, doesn't onDraw Gizmos get removed automatically on build? You will still get an error. Unless they've changed that recently. But if you use stuff like handles, even inside onDraw Gizmos, you're going to get an error on build. But it's not run during runtime. Like if you make a build, none of the onDraw Gizmos functions are going to get called unless you call them for some reason. But yeah. Like technically what we need to do to like fix the error is just to do this, right? How do you feel about using custom editors to break out the editor functions for the scripts and have it all in one place? What do you mean by break out the editor functions from the scripts? Oh, like to move this code out of mod behaviors? I'm generally like, go with whatever works for your project. I think there's value in being able to do this, like these very simple scripts where you just like chuck some code into the onDraw Gizmos functions to get the results you want very quickly, right? And quite often if you're working on a project, you're like, everything's going to be a mess generally because you have deadlines and everything. So quite often you don't have time to set up the perfect tools, right? So quite often having these like very quick ways to set stuff up is really useful. But then, you know, obviously it's good to separate these things if you want to, but there's some extra overhead there. So it's just a question of like, is it worth it in your case, which I can't really answer. It just depends on the project, right? Yeah. But yeah, generally, if you make a custom inspector for this, then that custom inspector is not going to be included in builds. So in there, you wouldn't have to do the if Unity editor branching, right? Did that answer the question, or did I answer some other question? I'm actually not sure. What do you want? The Thor has a lot of thoughts in the background. Hey Thor. What do you want? Okay, cool. Any other questions so far? Also be sure to drink water. Hello there. I'm trying everything with him. Yeah, I don't know what he wants. Okay, no more questions. All right, cool. Let's see, what's up next? Oh right, I was going to show you one more neat thing. Handles. There's a draw Bezier function in handles, which is really neat if you want to make things look good. So I've done this for several projects, so especially in the case of like having this central manager that's supposed to point to a bunch of objects. Straight lines can often like look really bad, so sometimes I go too far in trying to make things look good in case you have time to do that. So draw Bezier is like a cubic Bezier curve. I think we did talk about those in the math class. We did, yeah. So you're familiar with these already. So you can actually make a Bezier curve using these, which is really neat. So it has start and spiral dot transform to position. And then, oh geez. Okay, we're gonna have to make some variables. Because then we need the tangent positions. We need the half height between these. So that would be manager position dot y minus barrel position dot y. Okay. Vector 3 dot up. Sorry, I'm just setting up just setting up the vectors needed to set up the tangents. There we go. So now we have the half height between them, and because we have 4 points, right? One is the manager position, one is the object position, and then one is set the tangents here and here. So how do we get these two positions is the questions, right? So we need to get this offset of like vertically and halfway between these objects. And then we can set up like sort of like an S-shaped Bezier curve between those, right? So half height is half the height between these. And then the offset for the tangent points is going to be vector3.up times half height, right? So then for the 2 tangent points, let's see, it's start tangent first. So then that would be manager position, and then minus offset, and then barrel position plus offset, I'm pretty sure. Color dot white. Jesus Christ, it needs a lot of parameters. So there's another, let's see. Okay, so there we go. There's another parameter in this one. It needs a texture, which can seem kind of weird, but there is actually a built-in Unity texture. I think it's in editor GUI utility white texture. There we go. It's just a tiny, I think it's like a 2x2 white texture, which is really useful actually, because then if you want to like draw a rectangle in the editor with some color, you can set the UI color and then draw that white texture, right? It's really good. And then width, let's set it to 1. And now I don't need this anymore. So now I have these prettier, goopy, soft lines, and I think they're really neat. So they can be pretty useful if you want to, even if you want to like set up animation paths or whatever, you can use these functions as well. But I just like using them because they look prettier, and I like it when my scene view is pretty. So they're really neat. So there's a lot of like useful functions like that within both handles and Gizmos to do stuff like this. Right. Cool. Let's see. All right. Trying to think of if we should talk about. Do you want me to implement the color and also make that work both in edit mode, and that would be a really good thing, I think. Let's do that. All right, so far we just had this like theoretical color value you could set, right? But it doesn't actually set any color. It doesn't do anything to these barrels, right? So I think it would be useful to look at how you would do that, right? There are many ways of like setting the color of an object. There are like, some of them are more instancing friendly, some of them create another material. And whenever you do editor code, you need to be like very aware of what is an asset versus what is just data, right? So one thing that you need to be careful with, especially if you're doing procedural mesh generation and doing stuff with materials, make sure you don't instantiate materials and make sure you don't instantiate meshes. Because you can get mesh leaks where, you know, every editor frame you're modifying a mesh, but you're also accidentally instantiating that mesh every time you modify it, which means that you're going to have a bunch of meshes that are going to get loaded into memory and you're going to crash eventually. And that's really bad. Or you might get meshes that leak out into the scene that then save to the scene file, and then you're wondering why your scene file is like 20 gigabytes. So yeah, you need to be careful with this kind of stuff. So whenever I deal with colors, whenever I need to color some objects, then I generally, both for in-game code and for in editor, I generally never use like direct material modification for that. I pretty much always use the material property blocks. Have you used material property blocks before? I don't know if you had any teacher go through that yet. Excuse me. Don't think so. Okay. So material property blocks are a very useful way that you can sort of do overrides for your materials. So you might be familiar with So you have a function. You could do get component, mesh renderer, and then dot material dot color equals color dot red, right? So there are things happening in the background here that you might not be aware of. It's very much a hidden quirk of Unity, and I think if Unity were to design the system now, I don't think they would want to have it work this way because it's kind of weird. But when you call getComponentMeshRender.Material, this will actually instantiate the material. This will create a duplicate of whatever it was you assigned in the editor on this object, and then assign that duplicate to the mesh renderer, and then it's going to set the color of that duplicate, right? So internally, you have now like duplicated this material, and it's kind of happening behind the scenes, and you don't really think about it when you start the game. It kind of just happens, right? So there's a very big difference between doing that and doing dot shared material. So shared material might be what people expect you to actually change when you change a color. So what shared material is the actual material asset, where if you make a material in the in your project, let's call it new material, set it some color, and then you assign this to some object, then this is what it's referring to in the materials array here, right? And shared material is pointing to the asset itself. So if you are modifying shared material.color, then the actual asset will be modified. And this is kind of dangerous, especially doing this like in the editor, like unintentionally, because then like all of these things are you're gonna have like multiple users of or multiple developers working on your project, and all of you are gonna have different values for this material depending on what you're doing in the editor, right? So then the solution for this that's both performant and makes a lot of sense in terms of assets is to use the material property blocks. Material property blocks are specifically to make a per renderer override for any of the material parameters. So rather than using any of these, which both have problems, this one will modify the asset, which is the material that you probably don't want to change like in runtime, right? And this one will duplicate the material, which at runtime, it means that since it's duplicated, that's going to be an extra draw call because it can no longer be batched with the other materials or the other objects using this material, because it's now using an entirely separate material. And in editor time, then this will leak assets. This will actually create multiple materials while you're in the editor, which means that it's not going to clean up all of those materials once you leave the editor. So I'm pretty sure this will throw a warning. I'm pretty sure this will throw a warning if you try to do this in editor code. The same thing applies to get component mesh filter. So mesh filter has another concept exactly the same way of like mesh filter dot mesh dot whatever you want to get from the mesh, right? So mesh in this case is referring to the asset, or referring to a duplicate of it, right? So calling dot mesh will duplicate your mesh, and then you're going to modify the duplicate. It's only going to duplicate it once, so if you do multiple calls for this one, it's going to refer to the same duplicate, right? So it's kind of like, it's a shorthand so that you can modify things on a per instance basis, but under the hood, it's actually duplicating whatever it is you're modifying, right? Sorry for the probably overly lengthy explanation of that, but it's actually really important to know the distinctions between these whenever you do any kind of modifications of materials or meshes in the editor. Yeah. So the concept of shared material versus material and shared mesh versus mesh is really important. Okay. Did that make sense, by the way? So the analogous thing is if you have the mesh in the assets, right? You could modify that mesh through code accidentally if you're not using the correct function here. Okay, I'm gonna guess that means this. Nobody's responding, so I presume everything is like super crystal clear. Yeah, so there are, heck, I don't know if I should mention this now. Why not? It doesn't matter. So if you find yourself in a situation where you do need, we actually do need to make a material, like in editor mode, then, or rather create any kind of asset. If you need to create a material or if you need to create a mesh, then, excuse me. If you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to create a material in editor code, but you want to make sure that you're not like leaking materials into the scene or whatever, there's a really useful concept that you can use. First, I guess I need to create the material. I don't know, this is probably the legacy shader. I don't even know if this is going to work. It doesn't really matter. So you would do something like this, right? Okay, so now if you do this in the editor, it's going to find the shader and then make a new material, right? But you need to be careful creating assets. This is an asset and this is going to like stick around and live forever until you tell it to destroy itself, right? So what this means is that like you might very easily, if some of your like references are lost, if like static references to a material is lost, which happens every time you recompile your scripts, and then you recreate this material, it's going to create another asset. And this is a very quick way that you can like get memory leaks in the editor. So every time you create an asset that's like only supposed to be used in code, in editor, and it's supposed to be temporary, then there's a useful concept of hide flags. So you can set hide flags of any Unity object. So you can set this one to hide flags.don'tsave. The one I usually use is hide and don't save. Like this one. This means that this asset is not going to be saved. So if you leave the scene, it's going to unload this asset. It's not going to like care about keeping this around. So I'm generally very like, anytime I'm in the editor creating assets, I always do this one, unless I specifically want to save this either to the scene or save it as an asset, right? Yeah. You can do shorthands for this as well, if you want. All right. And these hide flags work for like many different things. It's kind of like a weirdly flexible thing that's used for various stuff. You can hide components using this as well, which is kind of dangerous in some cases. So you can literally tell the mesh renderer to not be visible on this object by, just doing get component mesh renderer, set these hide flags to like hide in inspector, and now this is not going to be visible anymore. This is pretty dangerous. Only use this in like very specific cases where you know what you're doing. I've had several situations where you've hidden something because it quote unquote wasn't necessary, and then in the end you're just like, something breaks and you have no idea why, and there's no way to debug it because the thing isn't visible and so forth. So like be careful like how you use these hide flags, and be aware of like the pitfalls that could happen by using it. Yeah. Okay. All right. And that goes for meshes too. If you ever have like a temporary mesh that you don't want to be saved to the scene, you don't want it to be saved as an asset, then again, always use hide flags and make sure it doesn't save. All right. Went on a bit of a tangent there. I wasn't supposed to talk about hide flags. I just realized it's probably good to talk about it. Okay. I presume there's no questions about that. Right, we're doing material property blocks. Okay, so we had the problem of like, we have the two different ways of assigning color to a material, right? That's assigned to a mesh renderer. So this one had the problem of that it's going to duplicate the material, and that's bad. We don't want that to happen. And this one will literally modify the asset. And we want to do this per explicit barrel, right? We want these to have different colors, but if they modify the asset that they're all using, then we can't have multiple colors on a single material. That just doesn't work, right? So the third way of doing this, which is kind of the proper way of doing it these days, is to instead use material property blocks. So let's create a material property block. I usually call them MPB, which is very confusing if you're used to using like MBP for MacBook Pro. And I've like messed up this acronym so many times. And for some reason you can't like statically initialize that, which makes me sad. So you need to initialize that in onAwake or wherever you need it, right? Yeah, sometimes I use properties for this. So it could do something like material property block, and then I do a null check here. So if it's null, then we make a new material property block. So wherever we call MPB, we're now going to create it if it doesn't exist yet, right? Oh, it's probably good to have some types. I need a getter. I totally messed up this code. There we go. So basically we're making sure that, you know, every time we call MPB now, it's going to check, you know, does it exist? If it doesn't, it's going to create it and then return it, right? So this property is just going to be whatever we use to be able to access this thing, right? I don't know how much you've used properties. I presume you've used them a lot, right? So you're familiar with this type of code. Okay, so now we want some sort of function to, we need to make sure that this is colored by this, right? We have this color, we have a material property block now, but we're not actually using it. I'm also going to remove the extra material we put here. There we go. Right. Okay. So we want to be able to apply this color to the mesh renderer, right? So we need some sort of apply color function. So in this case, we, instead of like setting the color on the mesh render itself, like, or the material, generally you would do get component, mesh render. Let's call that R&D. And then you would do something like render.material.color equals this color, right? This is kind of the very simple way of doing it, that again, this duplicates the material. So we don't want to do that. So if we want to do this using the material property block, then there are two things that's useful to know. Material.color is kind of a shorthand for doing set color and a property called color, and then the color like this. So this is kind of what .color is doing under the hood. Although it's doing the optimized version that's not using a string. Yeah, so we don't need to use cached property indexes, I guess. Or actually, it's useful to mention that. So, wait, what is that? Must be destroyed explicitly in the undisabled method. Okay. But like, what if you have an object that doesn't, what if you have an object that doesn't have an onDisabled method? Like if it's just an asset, right? Okay, yeah. In that case, I guess you need to destroy the thing manually. Cool. Then do that, I suppose. I'm not sure if they're correct, but I presume they're correct, so. Okay, so if you, generally when you set materials, I don't know how much you've worked with like shaders and setting like material properties in general, then quite often you set like using properties like this, where you have a string for the property name, and then you set the color and you pass the data to the material, right? So generally you want to do this in a more optimized way. So you can sort of cache an integer for this. So if you use, I used to call them shader property color. There's a function called shader.property2id, where you can sort of convert a string to an integer ID, which makes your like color assignments and whatever property assignments you do much faster. So you would, instead of like using a string here, you would use that integer. So in case you want to make sure things are optimized, you would use that instead. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so now we're still setting this to the material, right? We're not actually using our material property block. So in order to do that, we now access our material property block, and then we do set color, and then that works pretty much the same way. So we define what property we want to set and what color we want to set, right? Because you could have multiple colors with different names in a single shader, right? So that's why set color specifically needs, you know, what color do you want to set? Do you want to set the thing called underscore color, or underscore color A, underscore color B, and so forth, right? So that's kind of what this first parameter is. So now we've set a color on the material property block, and now we just need to apply this to the actual mesh render, right? Because now there's no connection between the material property block and the renderer. So in order to do that, we need to do render dot set property block, and then our property block. Okay, so now we have a function called apply color, right? Good, that's neat. Now the question is, when do we do this? What is the what is the situation where we want to do this apply color? We might be able to say that, you know, maybe on enable, because then, you know, when the game starts, the color is then applied, right? So that's good for runtime. But then again, we still might want to make this update every time you edit the color, right? So kind of the first step would be to, I don't want to go to the documentation. So first thing you could do is apply color and on enable, right? So we could test this and see if it works, just straight up. Thor has opinions about applying colors. Okay, so now all of these are red, right? We can change the color, but now the problem is that they don't update when we change the color. But we can toggle the script, and then on enable is going to get called again, and now it's correct. So this is kind of like, it's correct when you, it's correct when you load the level, because then on enable is going to get called in all of these things, right? Or when you toggle the objects. There's a very useful function that you can use for specifically these types of cases. So there's a function called onValidate, and onValidate is going to get called every time you modify a value in the inspector. So anytime that changes, you can call some sort of function, right? And in our case, we want to apply the color. So now if we go back and recompile, now we can change this immediately, and everything is just sort of working. Yeah, it's a very useful function. Um, 10:40. Cool. All right, we're going for a break. I'm going to read Twitch chat. What's happening on Twitch? Except for people telling me that I'm just wrong. What happens if you now change the original material asset? I don't think, like, it depends on what you're changing on the material asset, right? Because you're still overriding the the property, and it doesn't really matter what the original material was. So it's kind of like, you have multiple layers of the stuff you have, right? You have the material itself, and the material has default properties. Then on top of that, you have all of your material property block overrides. So they're still going to override whatever you set the original material to, right? Well, changing shader type is something which doesn't have a color raising error in the editor. I don't think it will, no. I think the material property block, I'm pretty sure, is completely oblivious to whatever material you have. Like, it doesn't throw an error. I think it would if you directly set the color property of the material in the editor, but not using material property blocks. Any differences between handles and gizmos? There are some like subtle differences. So there are some like weird quirks. So if you have gizmos, if a gizmo is behind an object, then it's going to be sort of transparent and faded. And if it's in front of it, it's going to be opaque. But handles will be opaque regardless of if they're behind something. And you can sort of set the different, you can set how it handles the depth test if you want. If you want it to be called as if it's, if you want objects to be able to obscure your handles, you can do that too. So where, because right now, I think you can see that the line here is being rendered through this object, right? But if you want, you could do handles.ztest, and then you do less equal. In this case, if I recompile, I'm pretty sure it's going to get cut off. Yeah. So now it's actually being called by object. So if I create something, then this is going to be able to cover them. So default for handles is always, which means that it doesn't care about depth. I should have turned off the timer now. Missed the entire handles section. I didn't talk that much about handles in general, so like there's the whole thing about setting up handles for input and like highlights and selection, which is a whole thing which I actually haven't done that much. So I'm not sure how much I can confidently talk about that, but yeah. Are you gonna upload the VOD on YouTube? I think so. I'm pretty sure I can do that. I'm still gonna have to talk to Future Games and see if I can get their permission to do it, but they were fine with it last time, so I presume they're fine with it now too. I did everything completely out of order. Nothing according to plan, as usual. White checking for MVP equals null if it's always null since you're not initializing it. So in this case, I'm checking it every time I'm calling the property, right? So it's not being initialized here, which means that it's going to be null, like every time you've done an assembly reload, it's going to go null, right? Because this is not a serialized thing, right? Because it's not serialized, when you recompile your scripts, this one's going to be null, right? It's going to be null when you start the game as well, because then it's not initialized. And then it's going to get initialized here, and then it's going to return the material property block. But for subsequent calls, it's actually going to return the already created material property block, because if you're not like doing an assembly reload, the data is still there, right? Even though it's not serialized, it's still going to stick around. Well, until you do an assembly reload. Could you show Barrel Manager class? Does it contain only list of game objects? Barrel Manager has the list and it has the drawing of the kind of curved gizmos, right? It's drawing these white lines, right? So all of this is a drawing function. It's the only way of instantiating it in the editor. No, you can, there are other ways of doing it as well. Like you could probably like do it in Awake, but the problem of doing it in Awake is that Awake is not going to get called for assembly reloads, I'm pretty sure. So the problem is that you're going to lose the data in material property block, and then Awake is not going to get called, and then the rest of your code presumes that it exists, right? Yeah. So I think onEnable would probably work. I could be wrong, but we could try it out. Although I think onEnable has other timing issues. Like if you modify the color, property while the explosive barrel has been disabled since the last assembly reload, you're also going to get an error in onValidate, because then the material property block is not going to exist there, right? So that's kind of why like there are so many like weird like edge cases with stuff like this when it comes to like code timing and assembly reloads, so that if you have this property, you kind of don't have to care about that, because now every time you call this material property block property, it's actually going to like return the valid object, right? And it's always going to be initializing only when it needs to, right? The only downside is that it's going to do a null check, but it's fine. Yeah, I mean, we could do this. There we go. Stickmac, thank you so much for the Prime sub. Okay, so now we're logging Awake, onEnable, and onDisable, right? So go back to Unity. Now we have 6 onEnable, so that's 1 onEnable for each barrel, right? So now let's do an assembly reload. And onDisable is called first. It's disabling everything, and then it's enabling everything after that. But there's no Awake here. So if we were to initialize it in Awake, then the material property block would go null on that assembly reload. I'm pretty sure. It could actually not. It might only be static variables that go null. I'm not entirely sure. I usually have these problems with statics, and this is not a static. So this one might actually stick around. But I think if you... another example would be... I think if you were to close Unity, open a scene where an explosive barrel is disabled, I don't think Awake is going to get called for that object. I think Awake is called the first time it's actually enabled and active. Now I'm actually not sure. And because I'm not sure, that's why it's good to not like initialize things in those cases and rather just do a property like this. Assembly reload equals every time you compile. That's an example of an assembly reload, yeah. But yeah, sometimes I do these kinds of things for components as well. Have you done something to your editor to have it compile that fast? The thing I did to make it compile really quickly is that I started a new project that has 0 scripts. That's the hidden trick to have your things compile very quickly. Like the bigger your project, the slower the compile is going to be. Yeah. Right, let's see. I was sorting all of my stuff to make sure that Trying to figure out what to do next. How is Thor? All calm down now. Yes, Thor seems to be good. Yep, he's a little loaf on the streaming computer. How do you set up the barrels to use the material property blocks in the editor? My barrels doesn't change color. So first thing you need to make sure is that you have ExecuteAlways to make sure that this one is here, right? Because that makes sure that all of these functions are called in the editor. That would be the first step. And then the other stuff would be to make sure that you have the apply color function and that you call it in either on enable or an on validate or both. I'm doing both in this case. I think technically for runtime, it probably should have apply color in awake because we don't need to apply the color multiple times when we enable it, right? Oh yeah, the material has to support the setting colors as well. The default material does, so I was just using the default. In case you want to know the status of Thor.
Don't touch him.
I'm not going to touch Thor.
It's like, do not disturb this cat.
That's Thor. That's a peaceful Thor. Who has been very non-peaceful this whole morning. Let's continue. All right. I need to clean up some shenanigans I added. I think that's it. No. Cool. Sorry, I'm just sorting things because I don't like it when things are not sorted. All right. There was one thing I forgot to mention when we talked about handles that might actually be very useful. Right, so we did Gizmos.draw wire sphere, right? So I think in this case I might want to use draw a disk instead, because I don't think the vertical radius matters that much, or I guess it depends on the game. So I think in this case I actually would want to use handles dot draw wire disk. So this is basically a circle. So you set the center point with transfer and opposition, and then the normal, which is going to be the normal of the disk, kind of the axis you would imagine the disk would spin around, right? So we want it to be aligned with world space in this case. So I'm going to set it to vector3.up. Actually, maybe we want it to be aligned with the barrel. I don't know. Transform.up. There we go. And then the radius. All right. So now it's just showing this one circle instead, which I think it's a bit more clean, right? Instead of having this like three-dimensional shenanigan happening. And then also, one thing that's very useful is to color your handles, right? You might want to set different colors for different things. So the way that that works with both handles and gizmos is that you sort of set a static variable for the color that you want. So in this case, it's handles.color. So you can set this one to handles.color equals, we can set it to the color of the explosive barrel, right? And then afterwards, we should probably reset it because otherwise we're going to color every other like handler we're going to draw after this. So the default would be color.white. You can sort of think of it as a color that's being multiplied with whatever colors things have. So white would just be sort of like a identity multiplication that just like times one and then it's the same color, right? So now if we recompile, we now have a green little radius and a red little radius and some blue and purple radii. But yeah, so that's kind of how we set colors of Gizmos as well. And then obviously if we want to, we could do the same for the Bezier curves, right? We can set the handle colors to barrel.color, and then we can reset it at the end of this whole for loop. That did not work, right? Because this one actually has a color property. So in this case, we would do barrel.color in here. Some handles have a color in the actual function call. Some of them will use the global variable or the static field. There we go. Neat. Okay. Let's move on to scriptable objects. I think that would be a neat segue. Okay, let's talk about scriptable objects. I think practically, if you were to have a game where you had these types of like explosive barrels, you would generally not, like, I guess it depends on the game, but quite often you wouldn't really have a per barrel setting for, you know, radius and damage, right? Generally, you would want a more focused design. Generally, you would want to have maybe different types of explosive barrels, right? Where you have, you have the red explosive barrel is more dangerous than the yellow explosive barrel, which is more dangerous than the blue explosive barrel, and so forth, right? And then you would sort of have these categories of explosive barrels that are all the same, right? But in this case, you're kind of like letting the level designer set this per barrel. But quite often you would want it to be more consistent. So you want the player of your game to have a very predictable behavior for each barrel, because every barrel, if all of them are different, then you're never going to know how dangerous they are in case there's no consistency in terms of color and radius and amount of damage, right? So this is kind of a typical example where we might want to use different types of explosive barrels, right? So you would generally do this with prefabs, but I'm going to show an example not using prefabs, because just to show as an example for scriptable objects. So kind of what we want to do now is that if we want to have these separate categories for different types of barrels, then, where do we store that data? If we want to have, three different types of barrels. Say we want to have the red, and the red, the yellow, and the blue, right? Then it would probably be bad to just let this sit in each barrel where, you could modify it per barrel, but you just tell your level designer not to, right? That's generally not a good idea. So what we probably want is to have different categories of barrels that the level designer assigns, but you kind of leave it at that. You only assign the category, but you can't like tweak individual parameters for each barrel, right? So what we could then do is that we want to be able to move the radius, the damage, and the color into an asset. We want some sort of asset where we can refer to that asset from each instance of these to know, what type of barrel is this and what properties does that have. And then conversely, we want to be able to modify that asset, and that should modify every single barrel using that asset, right? So this is a good use case for scriptable objects. So we're going to create one of those. So let's call this barrel type. All right, so in this case, it's going to be a scriptable object. So we're going to change mod behavior to scriptable objects. And you can sort of think of scriptable objects as mono behaviors, but assets instead of components you add to objects, right? Otherwise they're like very similar in terms of, how they serialize and what data you can serialize and how all of that works, right? And then I usually do a create asset menu, so you can actually create the barrel types in your assets. So if we now go to Unity, and then we can right-click assets, create, and then we get barrel type here. So now we have the scriptable object as something we can create in our project view. So we do that, and then maybe we call this the red barrel, because this is going to be the dangerous one, right? And then we can do the yellow barrel, which is the less dangerous one. And finally, the blue barrel. Actually, let's make a green barrel that heals. There we go. That's better. Healing barrel. Okay, so now all of this data was on a per instance basis, right? Radius and damage and color is all on every single individual barrel in the scene. So basically we want to move that data from the explosive barrel itself out to the scriptable objects. So if we copy those and paste them here, they're now part of the barrel type, right? So if we go back to Unity and recompile, now if we look at these barrels, they now have these properties, right? So let's copy some stuff over. So we want the green barrel to be green, radius of 3, damage of -20, then it heals. I love explosive barrels that heal, they're the best. And then the red barrel is going to be red. I don't know, 10 damage is great. Yellow barrel, doesn't really matter. 5 damage. 2 radius, 3 radius. Okay, there we go. So now we have these 3 assets. And again, they're very much like mono behaviors, but they're assets, so they live in the project view, right? So now we want to be able to make the barrels refer to these assets to know what type of barrel is this and what are the properties that I have, right? So now we actually don't want all of this anymore on the explosive barrels, right? So instead, we're now going to refer to the barrel type, right? And we want to make this public. All right, so obviously a lot of things are now going to be a little messed up because we're referring to all of these properties, but they don't exist anymore, right? So in this case, we might want to just return in case it doesn't exist yet, because if it's not assigned, then the barrel doesn't have a type, right? So if type is null, we return. It's probably gonna have to do that in many places. And then we're, instead of reading the color we had per barrel, this is now going to go through the barrel type, right? So now it's going to be barrel type.color and barrel type.radius and so forth, right? Probably going to need to edit stuff in here. Right, that one did barrel.color, so this is going to be barrel.type.color instead. All right, probably going to get a null ref somewhere. Yep. Right, because in onValidate, we do apply color, but apply color expects there to be a type, right? So we use early out in case type is null. Just do one more assembly reload to see. Still broken. Apply color was set in onEnable. Actually, let's rename this to try apply color. There we go. And then we move this into the apply color. Then we need to care about all the use cases. All right. It got worse. Right, this one is also cool, we did it. We made it. All right, so now each of these has a barrel type field, but they don't have any properties anymore, right? So let's see if we can assign the red barrel to this one. So now this one seems to have just connected immediately, right? So now it does have a radius and it's red, right? And let's see what happens if we apply the red barrel to this one. It becomes red, and now it has the same radius as the other one, right? So we can do this for all of these. Let's do the yellow one for this. There we go. And then the green barrel on this one. Okay, so now we've sort of set up these archetypes, right? We have these 3 different barrel types. And one nice thing about this is that these are now all tied to these scriptable objects, right? Which is kind of neat. Someone was typing. Whomst type. Yeah, so now whenever we edit these properties, they're going to be also the properties that are going to be used for each of these barrels, right? So if we select these and then modify the red barrel, oh, can we lock selection? No, it doesn't draw Gizmos. Well, let's always draw those Gizmos. All right, so now if we go to the red barrel, we can modify the radius of the scriptable object, and it's now going to be applied to every case where we are using the scriptable object, right? Which is super neat. So now we have this like a central place where we set all of these things, right? So instead of having this per barrel, it's now just a type, and then we assign that type, and then it works across all of them, right? Yeah. Did that make sense, by the way? Any questions on that? I also do believe that if we change color, I don't think that's going to update. Yeah, it doesn't update the material property block. That makes sense. So in this particular case, in case you were to actually use this for literally explosive barrels, then you would generally use prefabs for this, because there's not really any reason to have a scriptable object specifically for this. But what you could have a scriptable object for, or rather what the advantage of doing that is that that data is no longer tied to specific objects, right? So an example of this that I use quite frequently is that if you have a game where you have like different teams. So you have team 1 and team 2, right? Then maybe there are a bunch of things tied to team 1. Maybe team 1 has a name. Maybe team 1 has a color. Maybe team 1 has a, I don't know, a slogan. Like maybe all of these different properties of quote unquote a team is something that you're going to need both in your in-game objects. You might need it in your UI. You might need it in the main menu. Like all of these things are like absolutely everywhere, right? Then in that case, it's really good to have a single source that all of these things can read from, where if you want to change the team color, you do it in one place and one place only, and then that updates literally everything else that is reading from that, right? So that's kind of the yeah, that's kind of the thing that you would do there in order to sort of share data between something like team color, which is kind of ubiquitous across an entire project. It's possible to move unvalidated scriptable object scripts. I'm actually not sure. You could make a custom editor, and then through the custom editor, update all the explosive barrels. Would you want to see how to do that? Like, just to make the color actually work in this case, because now the color is not being applied to the barrels. Oh, did you add onValidate to scriptable object? I don't think it would show an error. It's just that it doesn't, it's not going to get called by Unity, right? Okay, but would you want to see how we would set this up to actually work? But if we make all of these blue, then for instance, like toggling these or toggling the component would make it work, because then we're applying the color again, right? Okay. Yeah, let's do that. Why not? I actually pretty much never make custom editors for scriptable objects. It's possible, right? And I'm actually not sure. It has to be possible. All right, barrel type editor. We're going for it. Okay, so if you want to make a custom editor for something, then you can name it pretty much whatever you want. The Unity convention, I think, is that they add editor to the end of it, which sometimes gets really confusing. But you can name it whatever you want. I think you also need to have it in a folder called editor to make sure that it's not, to make sure that it's recognized as an editor script. Unless that's changed recently, that would be nice. Right, where did our, oh, because I moved it. Okay, so now we got this barrel type editor, right? So this is going to be our custom inspector for the barrel type. Okay, so the way to make sure that this one is recognized as the actual editor, then we need to add the custom editor attribute, and then we need to specify what type this should be a custom editor for, right? And in this case, it's going to be barrel type. And then the type, or we need to extend from editor as well. So now we've sort of told Unity that you know, this is going to be a custom editor for the barrel type. And of course, it's inheriting from editor because it's not a component anymore, right? Yeah. And then we can start overriding all the UI stuff that comes with this, right? So we would have, wait, I thought it was called OnGUI. Maybe it's not. Oh, it's on Inspector GUI, sorry. Chat sent this, there is ScriptableObjects.validate. Oh, why is that not in the... That's from the 2020.1 documentation, so it could be a new thing. Okay, so it seems to not exist in all versions of Unity. 2019.2, 2019.3 seems to have it. What version am I using? 2019.3. No, it's actually not in 2019.3. Yeah, no. Okay, so it's a new thing. So if you use 2020, then it does have it. Okay. Anyway, so now we have the onInspector GUI function, and this is kind of where we can override what should the inspector look like. So let's see if this works first and foremost. Good. No, wait, hold on. Multi-editing. There we go. Wait, what? Hold on. I'm getting a weird error. Monoscript is registered as both editor and runtime scripts. What is? Is it just not possible to make? Oh, it's probably renaming files and moving things around type of issue. Okay. Well, let's restart Unity then. Cool, the error is gone. Now it works as I expect. Neat. Cool. All right, so if you want to make a custom inspector, then onInspector GUI is going to be the function where you can start like overriding what you want the inspector to look like, right? So right now it's empty. So now we don't even have access to the properties that we used to have, right? So you could do base.onInspector GUI, and now it's going to call the base type, which means that we can now see whatever it would draw if we didn't like to make a custom editor script, right? So now it's showing all the stuff that it's generally showing without an editor script. Yeah. Let's see. There are several ways we could go here. Not sure if I should. Actually, let's do that. It's good to know. It's a little weird to do this in a ScriptableObjects in particular, but that's fine. Okay, how much UI code have you done? Like, or how much like immediate mode GUI code have you done in the in Unity? I presume you mostly use the like in-game UI system and not the I'm GUI system. I'm GUI? I'm GUI? I'm GUI? I don't know how to pronounce that. I only read it, never say it. Hey there. Hey there. Okay, is everything gonna explode if I do this? Okay, it's just that my mouse sensitivity is bonkers right now on this monitor, which is not great. But no, we can probably work with that. Why did my code go to a different monitor? Or is it bonkers? It just feels really weird because it's so big. Anyway, okay, this works. Neat. Okay, so the UI for this one is now bigger. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is gonna seem pretty boilerplatey, but it's for a good reason. And we're gonna talk about why these things are good later. I think, or maybe now. So when you're dealing with editor scripts in general, and when you're like, you know, juggling assets, you're dealing with fields on a bunch of objects, and you have a lot of things that you need to deal with, right? And one thing that's really important is to know, well, first off, know the concept of serialization and what that means. And in the Unity context, what is serialized and what is not serialized, right? Have you talked a lot about serialization? Like, you know, what's serialized in a model behavior and all of that stuff? I presume you have, or at least I hope you have. Kind of, but not the technicals. Okay. So in model behaviors, you're probably familiar with, you know, if you make, like if you make this one a public float thing, then this one is going to be, it's going to be many things actually. It's going to be serialized, right? It's also going to be visible, and it's going to be public. And you can sort of swap any of these terms out and like set things up so that they are serialized but private, for instance. So if you do float thing, then this is not serialized, not visible, or hidden rather. And that's going to be private, right? Well, sorry. There we go. So that's kind of the way the Unity sort of like, it's an automatic behavior for whether or not they're like public or private, right? So there are ways that you can make private variables serialized. You might have had, since you're in the coding class, I'm sure you've had like teachers talking about best practices and like weird stuff like that. They probably told you to do serialize field and then a float thing too. So this one is similar to this one in that it's private, but in this one, it's actually going to be both serialized and visible in the inspector, right? So this one is also going to be visible in the inspector, and it's going to serialize, and it's going to behave exactly like a public float would do in your inspector, but it's going to be a private field. So you can't like access it from any other script. And many people who use Unity say that this should be the way that you like initialize any like public fields or any like fields that should be accessible by the by whoever's using these scripts, right? But it's kind of up to you. I go various ways. It kind of depends on the project and situation. Yeah. And then there are like other attributes you can use. There's an attribute called hide in inspector, which will hide whatever thing you tell it to hide. So even if you make a public float here, this one is going to be serialized, but it's going to be hidden, but still public, right? So there are like various like combinations you can do in order to to make things visible and so forth, right? But the important thing to remember in terms of doing editor scripts is that whenever you have some data that you want to be persistent and reliably persistent between assembly reloads, making sure that stuff is serialized is kind of the guaranteed way of doing that, right? And having serialized fields also means that the type has to be serializable, right? Which not every type is. So yeah, so you kind of need to be careful about like what data you actually serialize. Yeah, and specifically in editor, they might actually have changed this for 2020. I don't know when this change hit, but generally if you use inheritance, then that's not going to get properly serialized by Unity serializers. So be careful about using that. Otherwise, most of the like basic types are serialized as you expect and whatnot. The same way you would use them in mod behaviors, right? Yeah. Right. So keeping this in mind is really important when you do editor stuff, because again, when you do stuff in game, you're not going to have to deal with assembly reloads, right? But when you do things in the editor, that's going to happen all the time, and you need to make sure that whatever you expect to be initialized has to be initialized or still exist or be persistent, right? When I say assembly reloads, most often that's just when you recompile your scripts. Sorry, I didn't like clarify that. Yes. Any questions about that, by the way? Quickly scanning Twitch chat to see if there's anything I missed. Is there any restrictions to serializable if you make your own classes for examples? Yes, there are many. Yeah, if you mark something as serializable, okay, so if you want to make your own serializable type, actually let's go to barrel type, because we're still drawing the inspector for that, right? Yes, okay. Let's say you have your own custom script, right? Public class, or custom class, my class. And you have some fields in this one, X, Y, Z, I don't know. Let's add a color. Okay, so now I have my class, and then if we want to make this serializable, generally what you do is that you add a system.serializable attribute to these. So this makes sure that you can serialize this in Unity, so that if you now have a field in barrel type of this type, you can do public, my class, thing. Now this one is actually going to be serialized properly, because if you don't have the serializable attribute, then this is actually not going to be serializable, which seems like it makes a lot of sense when you say it out loud. So if I recompile this now, you can see that we have all of these properties exposed, because all the types of this class are in and of themselves serializable, right? But if you have like non-serializable types in here, it gets messy, because then those are not going to be serialized, but you can still write to them and read from them in runtime. And yeah, so be really careful about, like, whenever you have something serialized, make sure that everything is serializable in it, and try to keep the serialized data kind of separate from like runtime data and stuff. Yeah, and this applies to like anything. So we can make this a list of my class, and then, whoop, why is my keyboard, hold on. Then we go to Unity now. Now we have a list of all of our custom classes, right? So this is kind of a neat way to like serialize any of your custom classes. Okay, so restrictions. There are many restrictions to this. So for instance, if you have another class called my other class, and say this one also has a rotation, but otherwise it inherits from my class, right? Because we want to use position and color, but also rotation. This might have been fixed recently, but generally, these don't get serialized properly. Whenever you serialize a list of my class, it's going to be of that type only. It's not going to care about any of the, if you make a type that inherits from that type. So it's not going to be able to like serialize what type all of these things are. So yeah, like you can't do like inheritance or like polymorphism when you deal with these types of things, at least when it comes to like storing stuff in a list, right? So quite often you're like, I'm actually not sure if this is the case now. I'm kind of curious. Right, actually, if you have a list where you have mixed types, right? You refer to the base type as the type of the list, but you populate it with stuff like my other class and other things like that, right? These are going to drop that type data and they're just going to become my class. So then it's going to be a list of the my class stuff. And the fact that you had some of these that were of the type my other class, that's going to have been dropped, which this is an absolute nightmare that this is not possible when you're making, say, a shader editor in Unity. But yeah. There are some exceptions, like if you inherit from scriptable objects, then you can sort of use inheritance and stuff and it works as you would expect. But it kind of depends on like how you set things up. Yeah, it's a whole thing. If you search for like polymorphic serialization, there's a bunch of blog posts that Unity has written about this. But I'm fairly sure that there was a change recently. I think it might be in 2020, but yeah. Other restrictions is that if you don't have references to, references just don't work. If you have references to classes, then they are going to be serialized as like copies of that class. So there's no way to keep references between things. So that's also going to be lost in serialization unless those things are Unity objects. So if they're inheriting from Unity engine.object, then references are going to be kept, but any other types are just going to be sort of duplicated for every single field that's referring to it. So that's another thing you need to really keep in mind, that like every single thing that you serialize is going to behave sort of like a struct in the sense that it's data on its own, and it can never be a reference to data, right? Yeah, did that answer your question? Also, is there anything else? Yeah, I don't know, like dealing with serialization when you make editor plugins is one of the most frustrating things because it's so messy and sometimes feels unpredictable and doesn't feel like it's consistent, and yeah. Yeah, I remember when I made ShaderForge, my solution was just to make everything scriptable objects. Like not even as assets in the editor, just everything was scriptable objects. For better or for worse. I think it was a pretty bad workflow, but the question is, should I show you the correct way of doing it immediately, or should I show you the bad way? And then we can learn from the bad way. I like going through bad methods of doing things sometimes. Bad way. Okay, cool. All right, let's do the bad way of doing this UI. So we had the barrel type, right? Where we had this old UI for the radius, the damage, and the color, right? And then if we remove everything on Inspector GUI, then it's just going to disappear because now nothing is happening when this code is being called, right? So then the question might be, well, how do you actually draw things then? So on Inspector GUI, in here you can use all the GUI functions that you would use in any Unity editor, like EditorWindow, custom editor, and all of that type of stuff. So in here you can use all sorts of functions. So usually they're in GUI dot, or in GUI layout dot, or in editor GUI layout dot, or in editor GUI dot. So sometimes it can get messy to like juggle all of these different different ones, but usually, oh, I muted my computer. Okay, so you have these 4 different big classes containing many, many different functions for UI stuff. So the one thing you need to sort of keep in mind here is that the ones called GUI, the GUI and GUI layout contains UI that you would use both in-game and in editor. So if you want to draw a label, then that would be like GUI.label. So that's just text at some position, right? And usually when you draw it with positions, you specify a rectangle for what rectangle within the given context you want to draw that text, right? There's also GUI layout, which automatically does layout for you. So in that case, you don't actually need to specify a position. So in this case, you just pass some data into it, right? Or pass a string into it for what you want the label to say. So the idea between these 2 divides of all these 4 different scripts is that these use explicit positioning using rect. So you have to specify exactly where each of these elements go, right? But if you use GUI layout or editor GUI layout, then these have implicit positioning. So kind of like has an auto layout. And generally, I tend to use GUI layout and editor GUI layout a lot. If you really need very explicit control over where you position your UI stuff, then you would use these 2. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because it can get very messy by juggling all these different terms, because you tend to use a mix of all of them quite often. Okay, so in this case, we're using GUI layout.label. So again, label is not a concept that's only for the editor. So in that case, it's in GUI layout rather than editor GUI layout, right? Okay, so if we now go back to Unity and recompile, we now have a label that says new, right? So this is kind of how you can start constructing your custom UI in Unity using all the functions in GUI layout, right? So you could do a button as well. So you could do GUI layout.button, do a thing. And then if we go back to Unity, recompile, we're now going to have a button that says do a thing that does in fact not do a thing. But if we wanted to do a thing, we could make an if statement, because this one returns true if you press the button. So if you then want to make this do something, you can then have that code here. So if we do debug.log did the thing and so forth. So if we go back here, press do a thing, now it says did the thing in the console, right? So now we have a button to do something, which is kind of neat. So you can sort of see how you can start constructing a UI like this, right? And this is where you sort of have pretty much all the UI elements that you would expect to have are here, right? Let's say we made an enum things. I don't know what to call this one. There we go. So now we have an enum of a bunch of things. And then we could make a things field in this one. So then if we want to show UI for this enum, then we can do GUI layout. Actually, this is probably going to be editor GUI layout, because I don't think you can show enums in in-game UI. So editor GUI layout dot enum pop-up. There's a bunch of overloads in case you want to separate the labels versus the actual names of each enum. But in this case, they generally return the new value and then you pass the current value into them. I don't know what this one actually wants in this case. There are too many overloads. I feel like the first one should work. Why does this not work? Oh, because it's system.enum. Can you typecast to enum? Or wait, do you use the... Okay. Maybe you just cast it to enum. Is that how that works? And then you cast this to things. Or just like that, I guess. There we go. So now we have an enum dropdown where we can choose between bleep, bloop, and blop, right? Yeah, so you have all of these different like ways of doing stuff. We could have like some value, and then we could do some value equals editor Google layout. Horizontal is not in there. It's probably in Google layout then. Horizontal slider. There we go. So this one wants the value, left value, right value. So maybe we say -1, 1, and some value for the current value we're passing in, right? So now this one is going to return the new value. So if we go to the editor, we now get a horizontal slider that seems very broken. Does it not support negative values? Oh, values first. Whoops, I know how to use parameters. There we go. So now we have this little slider thing, right? Yeah. So that's kind of how you can start setting up UI like that. And let's see, what else? So some of the stuff that's really useful is that like you can start, so if we just have these two, for instance, so now we just have the button and the enum, right? Then sometimes you want to like put things next to each other. So then by default, everything kind of stacks vertically, and that's just how GUI layout works, right? If you want to set things to have a horizontal layout instead, there are sort of two ways you can do it. Sort of the old way of doing it is that you can do, it would be GUI layout dot begin horizontal. So that kind of starts a horizontal layout, and then whenever you don't want to have a horizontal layout anymore, you do GUI layout dot end horizontal. So now everything within these two is going to have a horizontal layout. And again, it's auto layout, so they're going to be sized automatically as well. So you can see that if you change the size of the window, they're all going to like change their size respectively, right? So we can like keep adding things here. So we can do a GUI layout.label again and save things. And then we go back here. Now this one is going to get inserted here horizontally, right? And so forth. You can also control these a little bit more than just this, because sometimes you don't want like this one to stretch like this and it looks kind of strange. So if you want to do more explicit control, pretty much every GUI layout component has a set of parameters you can add to the end to them called GUI layout options, where you can do stuff like GUI layout.width. So now we can specify an explicit width for this label, where maybe we want this one to be 100 pixels exactly. So if I now do that, then it's not going to get resized if I resize this. So let's do a bit less than that. So now you can see that the size of the things label is consistent, regardless of the size of the window, right? Whereas the other ones are going to shrink. Yeah, so you can control things like this. There's a bunch of like, you can do GUI layout.minimum or like min width, max width. You can set height and all that stuff as well, depending on like what your current situation is and how you want to set things up. Yeah, so this is super useful in case you want to like do more pretty like inspectors for stuff, or you know, all the different stuff that you're, whatever tools you're making, whatever inspectors you might have a custom inspector for, you can use all of these functions in order to set that up. Okay, sorry if that was a lengthy explanation. Any questions about the GUI layout stuff? Oh, actually, I didn't show the newer way of doing this. What's the bad way that we shouldn't use? I haven't actually gotten to that yet. Sorry, this is all useful. The things I'm talking about are actually useful, trust me. Right, so there's a different way you can start like horizontal scopes like this. Oh, by the way, there's also GUI layout dot begin vertical, and so you can like mix these different types of layouts, right? This is only 2020, by the way. No, this has been in like way back. So you've got all of these functions. I think that the new thing I'm going to talk about now, I think that might be new for either 2018 or 2019. I could be wrong. But yeah, so instead of using the GUI layout begin and end, you could do using GUI layout dot horizontal scope. Actually, new GUI layout dot horizontal scope. And then you open brackets, and then you put all the things in there. Whoops. So this is kind of the more safe way of doing this. It doesn't exist in all Unity versions. This is relatively new. I don't remember in what version they added this. The reason this is safer is that if you do stuff like return in the middle of this, this is going to be resolved correctly. But in the other version, where you use begin and end, then if you skip the end function, everything's going to go to hell, and your console is going to scream at you because you're pushing more GUI clips than you're popping, or whatever that cryptic message is. So this is a really neat way of setting up scopes. I don't know how much you've used the using keyword, but long story short, it creates a type, and when it leaves this scope, it calls a function inside of the horizontal scope that disposes the function, regardless of how you leave these. So you can return in the middle of this, and it's going to get called still. Because otherwise, the other method is like prone to like issues if you miss out on calling that thing. Yeah, I guess we should make sure this works. There we go. Heck, we're running short on time. I don't know if we have enough time to talk about the thing that I wanted to talk about. Like the bad way and the good way of doing the thing that we were supposed to do. We could talk a little bit more about UI. Are there any questions about UI so far, or like something you want to know how to do? Because otherwise, like all the things you see in Unity UI in general are using these types of functions. So again, if we go back to like editor, editor GUI dot, there's object field, which you see everywhere in Unity. Layout, sorry. So if we make an object field, then the serialized property is null. I guess we don't have any objects. What are the actual parameters? I rarely use these. Right, label objects, object type, allow scene objects. Or object type, allow scene objects. Okay. What did you do to use this custom editor in the editor? Right. So if you want to mark something as a custom inspector, which is what we're tweaking right now, you do custom editor and then type of. In this case, it's this barrel type scriptable object, which means that it's the custom editor specifically for the scriptable objects that we created earlier. So the inspector is showing that UI for that, right? Yeah, so, and then you need to make it inherit from the editor type. You might also have to put this script, this like CS file in a folder called editor. Otherwise it might not be recognized as an editor script. So Thor is having a situation again. Well, I'm gonna give him lots of cuddles during lunch. Thor! Hey, beast. Right, okay, so you can make like object fields as well. So object fields would be whenever you make like a public transform or whatever, that's going to use an object field that has this thing where you can that opens up, you know, Unity's window where you can pick objects and so forth, right? Thor, hey, hey. Okay. Sorry, this is cat therapy. Okay, Thor. Hey. Okay, what else? Right, we haven't talked about styles. There are a lot of like really useful built-in styles that you can use. So in addition to having like in addition to having these like layout properties like width and stuff, there's also a style that you can assign to them. So for instance, we had this label, right, that said things. Let's add 2 more labels down here. Don't need the width anymore. All right, so now we have 2 labels here, right? That says things. So there are a lot of like really useful built-in styles that you can use that kind of easily gets you to be able to like style things differently. So there's a class called editor styles, which contains a bunch of like styles that you might see in Unity's editor. So if you set this one to like toolbar, and we go back, this one now has the same styling as these toolbars up here. It's a bit hard to see. It used to be easier to see in the old UI style of Unity. You can even make it like, you can make it look like a button. So, like if you want the current like, the current skin that the editor is using, and you want the style of the buttons in that one, you can do GUI.skin.button. So now this is a label, but it's going to look like a button. So now it says things here, and it's not a button, but it looks like one, right? Because we just stole the style from the current GUI skin, right? So we can do editor. Actually, let's keep that. So we can do editor styles again. We can do, we can, for instance, do bold font or bold label. And then we go back. So now this one is in bold, which can be useful if you want to set up like some categories or something. So let's call this category, and then you might want to have some like space above this one. Then you can do GUI layout dot space. So now we can add like pixel space here. So now if we recompile, this should move down. So now we got this like neat little breathing room there. So this is like how you would start constructing your UI, whatever it's used for, right? Maybe I already said this, but what are the advantages to custom editors? The advantage is that you can customize the way they look, and all the different functionalities that go into it. And quite often you want to add some functionality to it that, you know, you might want a button that does something to your object that you have selected. You might want to make it look prettier because quite often the default layout is just a flat list of all the things, right? But quite often you have categories of things if you have these like really big objects with a lot of fields, right? In that case, it's super useful to be able to categorize things and make things look better, right? And then all of this UI stuff, it's also the code we've done now is the same thing you would do for custom editor windows, right? If I open like, I don't know, if I open, is there a good sprite packer? Sure. Like this sprite packer window also has a bunch of UI components, right? The same way we do in this. So if you want to make a custom editor, then like all of this is done the same way, right? And we are going to make a custom editor window soon. But yeah, otherwise the advantage is that you can add custom functionality to your custom editors, and you can make them have a layout that actually makes sense, right? Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Oh, right. There was another thing I was going to talk about. Right. So if you have, we talked about styling, right? Where you can change the style of something where this category label is bold rather than not. One that I really like to use is one called helpbox, where it's an editor styles.helpbox. So now we put it on the whole category of this thing. So now it's like encapsulated by this little box, right? Actually, let's make a bigger one. You go layout dot vertical scope with that style. And then we want this horizontal thing inside of that vertical scope. And let's put these in there too. So now there's a little box encapsulating all of these things, which I think is really neat. Because quite often it's nice to like categorize your stuff like that. Yeah. Maybe I can show you an example. Okay, here's an example. So this is a custom editor window and a plugin that I've written that is specifically for recording your stuff. So in this case, this is entirely like custom UI stuff, and just having all of these properties exposed immediately is going to be terrible, right? Because not all of them are relevant at all times. Some of these things are optional. So if I want to, like, if I check multi-sampling, then I want this one to be enabled, right? Or if I enable super sampling, I want to show some more data down there, right? So this whole thing is like all custom UI code where, like, yeah, I want some things to only be visible if you select enable or disable certain features, right? So it's a really nice way to like kind of section up all of your stuff and do a nice layout. Like this whole layout here is not even close to what Unity would do by default, right? Yeah. It was just an example of what you can do with custom UI stuff. So here's an example of by far the biggest thing I've ever made in Unity. It's ShaderForge. So ShaderForge is like, most of ShaderForge is built using the like non-layout components. Most of this is like explicit positioning of telling exactly where everything should go, right? But this is like a ton of like custom UI stuff. It's rendering like a mesh, and it's got like nodes, and all of this stuff is just like functions to draw within an editor window, right? Yeah. This is something I did after I graduated from Future Games. I don't know how long after, 2-3 years after I graduated from Future Games. I don't remember. But yeah, so there's a lot of different stuff you can do with this. And I mean, I think to people who aren't used to like making editor tools, then ShaderForge might feel like a native Unity tool because it's just kind of works as you expect, and it's got a lot of like advanced things that might seem like you're not able to do, but all of this is like available to users, right? You can make like whatever you see in Unity's UI, that you can do, right? Which I think is really neat. Yeah. So even like stuff like drawing all of these different textures and whatnot, that's also UI functions. Like all of these create UI things that are then drawn. You can do, let's see, that's a very good example. Thor has some thoughts right now. So even stuff like this, you can even animate stuff. I can tell the UI to like update every frame, and then I want this one to be drawn. And yeah, all of this is just a bunch of editor code. Yeah. All right, we are closing in on lunch. Any final questions or thoughts? I want to have a shader course with you at Future Games. because that's kind of the thing I do the most. But I guess not. The scroll menus where selection is in center is great. Oh, the like this thing where like pick different stuff. That's my own thing. I designed that, and I'm really happy with it. It's super useful for like quickly accessing stuff, because like quite often like digging in like node like browsers with a bunch of categories is just garbage. So I really like having quick ways to access stuff, to like quickly add nodes. Heck, I should do like a post-mortem on ShaderForge. There were so many mistakes I did. I was pretty new to both shaders and like editor scripting in Unity when I made it, and there's so many bad things in the code. But hey, it works, so that's good. Okay, all right. There aren't any more questions. I'm guessing we're going for lunch. How long did it take to make? It's difficult to estimate because it's always in stages, right? I think the first alpha took a few months where like I didn't have a whole lot of nodes and it didn't have like a bunch of features. But yeah, it kind of depends. Like what you consider to be done, right? Because I was updating ShaderForge for a very long time after the initial release, right? This reminds me of Unreal Engine. Good. That was the whole point of why I started working on it. Because I used Unreal before I used Unity. And then when I switched to Unity, I was just like, well, where's my shader editor? I want my shader editor, god damn it. Yeah, so I started working on it. Yeah, I used the Unreal Engine hotkeys for the multiply nodes and the normalize nodes and whatnot. How did you start? So it was sort of a two-part thing. One was learning shaders and one was setting up all the, learning how to do editor windows and stuff. But you kind of start, first step is to set up an editor window. Next step is, okay, how do I set up a viewport that is in the corner of a 3D mesh, and then how do I make nodes? How do I make a camera position within a UI thing, right? You kind of do things step by step, and then I just added more and more to it, for better or for worse, because I didn't really have a plan, which really shows if you read the code. but yeah, I don't know how to really precisely answer that question. Oh, someone on Twitch is asking, isn't ShaderGraph pretty similar to this now? To some extent, the biggest difference is that ShaderForge is obviously better. Jeez. No, the biggest difference is that ShaderForge is for the default render pipeline, and ShaderGraph is for URP and HDRP. That's the biggest difference. Did it start like an experiment, or did you have a plan to do like you did from the start? It was mostly an experiment. I think it was sort of became something bigger once I realized that, okay, holy shit, this is actually becoming something that can work. And because, there was this big like gap in the market of the one shader editor for Unity at the time was Strumpy Shader Editor, which was not used anymore. Tim Cooper, who worked on Strumpy Shader Editor, started working at Unity to make their own shader editor. But he was put on the UI stuff instead, and then he did UI, which was also a really huge thing and a really good thing that Unity sorely needed. But it meant that Unity just didn't work on the shader editor for a long time. And so there was this void of like, okay, there's no shader editor in Unity, just period. There is none. So I started working on it, and then once I realized that there are a lot of people who really want this, not just me, even though I made it mostly for myself in the beginning, I just realized that, okay, this is like wild how many people want this. And that made me realize that, well, I should probably sell it on the asset store, which I did in the end. And I put it at $90, I think. And yeah, $90 was the price for ShaderForge for a very long time, except for doing sales. And like that just sold an insane amount. It literally got us, I'm talking about NeatCorp, the company that started due to the income from ShaderForge. We got 2 full-time salaries, pretty much, from ShaderForge, which I think is probably pretty rare on the asset store in general. But just because ShaderForge was this thing that like a lot of people really needed, it really worked out well for us. Yeah, and that's how we started NeatCorp. How to make an indie studio. Find a massive gap in a market and make that tool. Oh, sorry. Enable my screen shake. But yeah, there were a lot of things that I had to learn like throughout this whole thing. And I also learned that being support for a project we released sucks. I had so many emails of people wanting support, asking really esoteric questions of like, oh, if I compile or make a build of the game on PlayStation 4 in this weird configuration, and if I look at it from behind the thing using the depth buffer to do the thing with the thing, it flickers. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like, where do I even begin to debug that? And I got like so many questions from people who were like, I don't know, sort of expecting me to be their personal tech artist of like, how do I make a shader that has a Fresnel glow? And I'm like, well, I mean, I'm making the tool. I'm not making shaders for you. So yeah, there was like, I feel like I learned a lot in terms of like dealing with support tickets and whatnot. It was a whole thing. Okay, all right. We are in lunch mode. I should probably also eat lunch. Oh, Vindaloo asks, is a recording video editor available to buy? Not yet. I think I want to release it, but I got pissed because Unity released their own recording tool that just kind of covered most of my features, and then I just felt like, whatever. You had raids from Sika Player, who was learning Gatsby. B. Wheatley, who was doing a RimWorld plus Dwarf Fortress plus Firefly game in Unity. Oh, neat. Yeah, thank you so much for all the raids and the, like, the subscription shenanigans during the whole thing. I just haven't been paying attention to Twitch a whole lot, so I'm sorry for, like, not doing that. But again, I'm doing this for the Future Game students primarily, so it is what it is. I just figure it's really nice that people can join in, and I can still talk to people during breaks. Because this is valuable information for many people. I started streaming without my headphones, and then I realized I actually don't need my headphones because I'm not listening to anything. But it felt really weird not to wear my headphones while streaming. So, I don't know, I feel like my brain just thinks the headphones are like required to stream. I don't know, so I'm wearing headphones. Just stylistically, you know, that's my aesthetic. I guess there's also like, I have this associated anxiety, like associated with like not hearing what you're hearing. I feel like if there's like some audio that's like keeps playing or something, I can hear that. But if I'm not wearing my headphones, there's no way for me to do that. And that seems spooky. Okay, all right. Let's continue. Can't read chat without headphones. All right, are all the students ready? Are y'all in place? It sounds like you're lined up to race or something. Not hearing anything from the students. We are here. Okay, there we go. Neat. People are here. Might be a bigger stream delay now. That would suck, but give them bad grades if they're late. As far as I know, I'm not grading them. I hope I'm not. I'm bad at grading.
You get an A. You get an A. Everyone gets an A.
Exactly. It's more like I don't give anyone anything because I feel like the concept of grades is kind of flawed, but... Okay, all right. Are there any questions about the stuff that we talked about last time? Or last time, the first half of today, I guess? I don't know if you've been like tinkering with stuff over lunch or if you've mostly been lunching. Guessing most people were mostly eating lunch. Lunching. Gotcha. Okay, we're like speeding through a lot of this. I'm sort of worried we're gonna go through all of my entire course plan on the first day, and then we got like 3 more days. Ah, geez, I'm nervous. You have to ask more questions, geez. So I think the plan right now is that there are a few more things I want to go through in terms of doing the UI stuff that UI stuff that we already worked on right now, and then I was going to show you a bad way of doing a thing and a good way of doing a thing. And then we're going to go into talking about custom editor windows of like, how do you make your own window pop up that you can do things in? Kind of like the 2 things that I was showing you, right? I was showing you ShaderForge and my recorder plugin. Both of those are like editor windows where you can make your own plugin inside of, right? So we're going to go through how to do that. Then I was thinking we could go through how to make a bigger tool, kind of like a tool that you would use in the scene view with lots of different shenanigans when it comes to input and consuming events and dealing with mouse position in the scene view, all of that kind of stuff. That's going to be sort of a big example that encapsulates a lot of the things we've talked about. I don't know if you want to do that one like practically while I'm coding it, or if we could rather do that, like maybe I can go through the whole thing and talk about exactly every part along the way, and then after today I can give you like 3 assignments, and you can do whichever or how many or none of them if you want, where they're sort of at different skill levels. Like one of them is a bit easier, one of them is medium, and one of them is like, maybe I'm not sure how to do that thing. Yeah, so I was thinking maybe we can do that. I haven't like thought of those assignments yet, but I can do that after today's lesson. Because maybe it's good that you have something to work on tomorrow, because I'm not going to be streaming or doing a lecture tomorrow. And then on whatever days after tomorrow, I don't know how weeks work, we can talk about how to do the things that were in the assignments. Yeah. And maybe talk about stuff that you have questions about or whatever. And then for the next week, I'm going to need to plan some more proper stuff ahead. Yeah, because I haven't done the plan for the second week. I was thinking the second week would be the practical one, and the first one would be the more theoretical, or I don't know, the lecture-y part. Right. Okay. So we were toying around with UI, how to set up like UI controls for making buttons, making labels, making enum pop-ups, making sliders, how to do layouts like space and do bold fonts and stuff. This system is pretty deep. Like you can go, there are a lot of things you can do with all of these styles, but I feel like there's not a whole lot of value of me going through all the different things. Because generally it's kind of like, as long as you know the overall structure, hello there. As long as you know the overall structure, you can then sort of dig into the stuff you need for whatever project you have, right? So yeah. Okay, so in this case, I've sort of talked about UI in general now, but I haven't really been talking about specifically what this UI script was for. Hold on, let me just pick up Thor. All right, cat acquired. We haven't really talked about specifically what that was for, right? Because I was mostly toying around with UI within that context, but in this case, we had these barrels, right? We had the green barrel, red and yellow barrel, and they have various properties that are currently just hidden because we just replaced the UI, right? But if you remember, the properties we had on them was color and damage and radius, right? So say we want to show those. So how would we do that? Well, let's clean this up a little bit. Can probably remove basically all of this. Okay, so now we're just using the base class on inspector GUI. So now this one is going to show the default of this. So now we got the radius, the damage, and the color, right? So what if we wanted to do that manually? Let's say we wanted to do this in a custom way, and we don't want to use the like built-in for things for the entire UI, right? So in that case, we need to be able to access the object that this editor, because again, we're now in the script of the inspector, right? We're not on the object itself. Sorry, Thor is being a bit of a mess right now. I feel like Thor just doesn't like me talking. He's very upset. How can I give other people attention and not Thor? Not even other people. I'm just talking at my computer. Jeez. Right. So now let's set up an inspector that would look kind of like this. And I'm going to do that in the bad way first, and then we're going to do that in the good way. Okay, so first off, we need to be able to access the object that this inspector is inspecting, right? Like, because now we don't have access to that. And that is in a field called target. So target is going to be a reference to the object that this, to the actual scriptable object that we have selected, right? That the inspector is looking at, or is inspecting, is the word. Target is a Unity engine.object, so we probably want this in like the actual type of the thing we're inspecting, right? So we're gonna do barrel type, barrel equals target as barrel type. Why did I add parentheses? Okay, so now we have access to all the properties of the barrel, right? Because now we have barrel dot color, damage, and radius. So we could do GUI layout dot label, and then we can write, let's see, radius, and then we append the barrel dot radius to that. So now if we go back, recompile, we now have a label that's showing the radius, right? But we can tweak this. Now it's just a label that is telling us the radius, but we can't actually do anything with that. So, all right. So as we talked about before, GUI layout has a bunch of different things in order to show controls where you can edit stuff, right? So in this case, we want probably editor GUI layout. I could be wrong. We want a float field, right? Because it's a float type that we're displaying. And we probably want the label to be radius. And then we want the actual float value, I think, yes, which is barrel.radius. And then like the other controls, this one is going to return the new value in case we change it, right? So then what we want to do is we want to assign barrel.radius, or assign this to barrel.radius, right? Thor is in a
I've like walked over to it like 5 times. He's like,
Thor.
oh.
Can you see if he wants to go under the blankets?
He doesn't. I've tried hundreds of times.
Oh. I think he wants lots of scritches then. Indefinitely. Probably. Sorry about Thor. Thor is having a day. Okay, so now we set up this float field and we're assigning it to the barrel radius. So if we go back, recompile. Now we have a float field, right? And we can actually change this radius. So we can sort of construct the whole UI like this now. Now we can tweak the radius by selecting all these things. And then we can do the same for the other ones. So we could do barrel dot damage equals same thing here, right? So now we got a damage field as well. So we got radius, damage, and then we want another one for the color, right? So that's going to be barrel dot color equals editor GUI layout dot color field color and barrel dot color.
Dude.
So now we have all these color fields. Okay. So now I've sort of talked about the bad way of doing this. Just going to reset all of these to the proper colors. Let's toggle these. Okay, so now there are primarily two things that are kind of wrong with the way that we're doing this right now. We have sort of kind of ignored everything that has to do with serialization at this point, and we are kind of just modifying the raw values of the barrel type immediately. There are a lot of caveats when it comes to, like, if you edit something, then you also need to make sure that the serialized data is either marked as dirty, in other words, it's marked as having been changed, right? Or you need to use the undo system to make sure that that happens automatically. The second problem is that, well, undo doesn't work. We don't have undo for this. So if I right now go to the red barrel, I change damage to 16 and I press undo, it's undoing the selection. And this is still 16. So we now have these two problems of, like, directly editing the barrel type radius and damage and color without marking the asset as dirty means that we could theoretically edit these and then leave Unity and then they're not changed. And it doesn't show up when we save our project, and it doesn't, like, actually save at all. And this is something that is kind of frustrating to deal with, because dealing with it is generally kind of messy, because it involves, I don't know if you care about, like, how to do it manually, but quite often it comes down to, like, so let's say you would look at the radius, like float, new radius. Then you would make the float field, it would assign to a new radius. Then you would check if new radius is not equal to barrel.radius. In other words, it changed, right? Then we need to mark this object as changed, right? And the sort of the way to do that, both making sure that it's being set to dirty as well as being in support of the undo system, is that you use undo.recordObject. So then you record the object that you're editing, which is barrel in this case, right? And then record object also has the name of the undo. So change barrel radius or something. So this is what's going to show up in Unity as in edit undo. So it says undo selection change in this case, but if we want to undo something we do here, then this is going to be the string that shows up there. So if the radius is different, then we want to first record the object that we're changing, then we want to apply the value, right? So after we've done that, then now we can then set barrel.radius equals new radius, right? So this is kind of how you would manually use the undo system, both for making sure the object is marked as dirty, as well as making sure that we can support the undo system. So now, I'm pretty sure, at the very least, that setting the radius now, we should be able to undo that. So if I edit the radius, we go to edit, it now says undo change barrel radius. And if we hit that, it actually undoes now. And as you might expect, if we extend this to the other things, then you might be able to tell that this is going to be a lot of boilerplate, right? And it's going to be a lot of like frustrating code. So there is so this is kind of the bad way of doing this, but I think it's useful to talk about because the undo system in general is very powerful and useful for stuff like this, because it like automatically marks whatever the thing you're marking as, whatever thing you're recording for undo is automatically going to mark the scene it belongs to as dirty. In other words, if you change something with it, then the scene is going to recognize that change. If you don't use the undo system like this, then you're either going to have to mark the scene as dirty yourself, or this change is just not going to be applied in case you like make a change to the scene, leave the scene, go back to the scene, and then it's going to be reset, right? So using the undo system for this is really, really useful. Now, specifically, if you want to deal with properties like this, there's a much better way of doing this. So again, this is kind of the manual way of doing the whole undo system, right? So it has a lot of boilerplate, but there's another way that also has a bunch of boilerplate, but is way more safer. And it's sort of what Unity expects you to use as well. So we're going to change this now. So this is sort of, again, this is sort of manual way of using the undo system and whatnot. But let's go back to this one here. Oh, there's also one more problem with this. The other problem with this is that we don't support selecting multiple objects. This is something you need to explicitly support in your custom editors. So if I select multiple things now, it says multi-object editing not supported, right? So that's bad. So what you need is an attribute for that. Can edit multiple objects is the attribute you want, but that doesn't make that work immediately. So even if I select these two things, you can see that, well, we're still, like, these have a different value for each of these, but it's only showing the red barrel's values. That's not how Unity's inspector usually works, right? If you select this green barrel, you can see that it has this type. If you select the red barrel, now it has this dash to show that these have different values across your selection, right? But if we look at our code, it's not doing that, right? So then it's like, oh geez, how do we do this, right? If you want to do that manually, then instead of target, you have targets, and that contains all of your selection. And again, you can do this manually if you want to, but we're going to do this the other way, that sort of automatically makes multiple objects work and automatically makes undo work, with just some extra boilerplate on top. Okay. So I'm gonna delete all the shenanigans here. So now we're back to the state where undo just doesn't work. Okay, so first off, one of the useful things about custom editors is that they also have on-enable, just like your game objects. So on-enable is sort of the kind of the awake of your inspectors. So we can do debug.log inspector on-enable, or barrel type editor on-enable rather. So now we got that message there, right? If I clear the console and then deselect and reselect, it calls on-enable again. So this is going to be called for every single thing we select, even if we add or remove to the selection. So what this means is that anytime our selection changes for selecting these barrel types, on-enable is going to be called. So this is kind of where we can initialize stuff for our editor. So Unity has a concept of serialized properties and serialized objects. And it's very useful to use those in contexts like this, because using serialized properties can automatically handle all the undo system stuff. It automatically handles setting things to dirty and so forth, as long as you use the right functions for it. So what we're going to want to do is that first you want a serialized object, which you can serialize objects. This one is going to refer to the serialized version of this object. If you want to set that up manually, you can also do, in our case, we have target, right? So we can do a field like serialized object. I usually call it SO. You can do SO equals new serialized object of the target, right? So you can do it in various ways. But in this case, I think just using serialized object works fine. Yeah, so serialized object is now going to be the serialized object that we're inspecting, right? Okay, let's actually cache that here. Actually, we want a field of that. So the next thing we need to do is what is actually serialized among our things, right? Because we have the barrel type and we have radius, damage, and color. So these are the things that we're going to want to make a serialized property for. So then we make fields for that. Serialized property. And then the way that I usually do this is I call them prop and then the name of the specific property that we're looking at. So now I have prop radius, prop damage, and prop color. And I just deleted everything. And then what we need to do is that we need to initialize these, because right now they're just not referring to anything, right? So then what we can do is that we basically take these, right? Prop radius, prop damage, prop color, and then we need to assign something to all of these. So what we need to assign in this case is that using the serialized object, we need to find the properties. So we can do SO dot find property, and then we have the properties as strings in this case. And then we have the strings. And they need to exactly match the strings in your type. So otherwise it's not going to be able to find them. So in this case, it's all lowercase. So if we go to the barrel type, these need to be exactly the same. Okay, so now we found all of the properties in this one, right? Next thing we need to do is that after we've loaded everything in onEnable, we can go to onInspector GUI. And in here, we can then use something called property fields. And property fields are kind of like automatically picking which one of these you're supposed to use, as well as automatically handling undo, as well as automatically handling setting things to dirty, as well as also handling multi-selection of objects. So this is where, you know, the usefulness of properties really shines, because this is, yeah, it's extremely useful to just do it this way rather than setting everything up manually, because you get all of those things for free. And again, it's sort of what Unity is expecting of you, because every other system sort of works automatically with it, right? So in this case, we don't actually need a reference to the object barrel, because what we're only interested in is kind of actually just the serialized properties, right? That we're editing of the scriptable object. And that's what we want to save as well. Or rather, that is literally what is saved. Okay, so what we need to do then is using these properties. I did not mean to do that. I don't want to decompile stuff. So grab all of our properties. That was a wild hotkey that I just pressed. And then we'll have our properties here, and then there's a thing in Editor GUI layout called property field, and then we can just fill it in with all the stuff. And now we have set up all the properties, right? There is one more thing we need to do though, and you need to prepare the object you're inspecting for change, like whether or not you You can't just make property fields without first updating the scriptable object to make sure that it's up to date. The serialized representation is up to date, rather. So usually you have to do scriptable serialized object dot update before you do anything else that can modify these values. And then after you have all of these fields, you do scriptable serialized objects dot apply modified properties. You can also see that there's another one called apply modified properties without undo, in case you want to do that. So it's sort of up to you in your use case, but generally you would want undo. So even though this is a little bit boilerplatey, it gets you a lot of things for free, right? And if you want to, you could put a lot of this stuff in on Inspector GUI as well. It's just that if you want it to be very optimized, then this would be the way to make sure that your like inspectors aren't sluggish or whatever. Because one thing to note about GUI, which we're going to get into soon, is that GUI is actually a loop that is run multiple times, even on a single frame, which is kind of weird. So you probably don't want to put a bunch of code in there. Okay, so let's see if this actually works. So now we can see these dashes, right? So now we can see that, oh, these actually have different values. And if I select individuals, it still works as expected. If I select multiple things, it's now going to look like this. And now we can still like edit all of this stuff, right? Everything still works. And I can also undo those things. So if I set this one to green and undo, it's now red. So now we've sort of, now we're automatically using all the entire undo system, and it's going to set these to dirty and everything, so it's going to save properly, which is really useful. Yeah. Oh, and another thing that I forgot to mention in the long thing about the things that you get for free with this is the whole thing about like it picks the type of field automatically. Like this one just picks the correct field in terms of you know, it's using the whatever field fits the type, which for radius and damage is float field, and for color is the color field. And it also picks up the attributes that we put on radius. If you remember, we marked it as a range from 1 to 8, right? And if you use property field, then they are in turn going to use something called property drawers, which is what the range attribute is that we're using here. We're not going to go into property drawers, partially because I almost never use them, but if you want to make like a custom attribute for your stuff that you want to look a certain way without having to make your entirely new, you know, editor script, then this could be a neat way of doing that type of stuff. Oh, one thing we could talk about. Remember how kind of the original problem that we bumped into and why we started doing this custom inspector was specifically because we noticed that if we now change the color of the red barrels, while the like gizmos update immediately, it doesn't actually apply the new color to the objects, right? So that's a good example of something we can now implement, because now we have full control over the editor. And while we could probably have used onValidate of the scriptable object, we're not going to do this way instead. Because it seems like onValidate might not exist in all the Unity versions. So, all right. So, one of the features of doing all of the property fields like this is that the apply modified properties function actually returns a bool, and it returns true if something changed, right? So you can do this. So this is if something changed. Then we want to do something else, right? That's pretty much what we want to do. If you change one of the, like this red barrel, right? Then we want to reapply the colors to all of the objects that are using the red barrel thing, right? Or maybe even all of them in case we have multi-selection. Yeah, so in this case, we actually want to have some way of like reapplying the color on everything, right? I could use onValidate in 2018.4. Oh, gotcha. Okay, cool. Okay, so now we want to be able to update all of the barrels, right? So one way we can do that is that we can add a function to Explosive Barrel Manager, because this one, again, has access to all of the barrels. So we can make a static function. update all barrel colors. There we go. And then we're going to call that function update all barrel colors. No. Right, so in here, we're pretty much just going to do a loop over all the barrels we have in the scene, right? So for each, all the barrels, explicit barrel, there we go. And then we do barrel dot try, where'd it go? We make this one public. And then we do barrel dot try apply color. And that's kind of it. So now we should be able to edit this one. And there we go. So now the colors actually do get applied immediately. So now everyone's lived happily ever after. Okay. Also, one of my favorite things about like doing editor scripting is that you don't have to like press play. It's really nice. Everything just runs immediately. It's so wonderful. The downside being that if you get like null reference spam, it just keeps going until you fix it. But that's fine. Okay, yeah, we're gonna do a little context switch. We're gonna stop looking at the barrels now for a while. All right, so now we're going to look at something a bit more simple. I kind of did this the wrong way around. I started with the more advanced stuff, and now we're going to make a more simple thing. But it's going to cover the thing that we haven't talked about, so that's going to be really useful. So there's a thing called a MenuItem, which is all the stuff you see up here, like all the stuff in Unity where you can go to edit and click all of these buttons, right? These are called MenuItems, and you can add your own of those. So let's do that. We're going to make another script. And in this case, let's say we want to make a tool where we want to snap an object to the grid. Like that's kind of it. We want to be able to click a menu item that snaps it to the grid, and then that's that. So let's try doing that. Let's call it snapper. And then go to that script. We don't really need model behavior in this case, because in this case, it's just going to be a static function. So we can even make the class static. So in this case, we're going to make an attribute for a function. So it's going to be MenuItem. And then we insert the path of where we want this function to be in Unity's menus. So probably edit, because this is going to edit the objects that you have selected, right? So we're probably going to want to put it in edit. And then we can call it snap selected object. All right, and then we need to make that a public static function. Probably want to snap multiple in case you have multiple things selected. And just to make sure this works, let's do a debug log. All right, so if we go edit, now at the bottom we have snap selected objects, and if I click that, we get snap the things. So that's how you like very easily just insert like functionality into the editor. Sometimes I do this just for like quick test scripts, just if I want to try running something. It's kind of nice to just slap in a public static function with a menu item and then to do the thing, right? Oh, by the way, there are other ways of doing that. Sorry, now I'm going on a tangent, but if you have explicit barrel, for instance, you can add a little sort of hidden functionality to this one in context menu. This is another attribute you can add where this is going to be in the context menu of that component. So if I now go back here and then right click here, I now have the do something thing here. So if you want to like add some quick functionality where maybe you want to edit this object or something, you can do that in a context menu, where if you just quickly want to throw in some function or to like print something or whatever, it can be pretty useful sometimes. Sorry, that was a tangent of a Unity tip, but it's good to know. Right, so now I want to make a thing that can snap the things you have selected, right? So if you want the stuff you have selected, there's a class called selection, and then you have game objects. So selection.gameObjects is specifically the game objects in the scene that you have selected. There are, if you do selection.objects, you, heck, I forget, it actually says from the scene here. I'm pretty sure there's a way that you can get all of your selection, even if you select assets in the editor and stuff in the scene view, right? To get like all of the things you have selected. But if you want to limit yourself to the scene, then selection.gameObjects will give you the game objects you have selected. I thought selection.objects was the everything one, but it says that it's from the scene, but I'm not sure if that's true. I don't know. Anyway. So we want the game objects you have selected, right? So we can do a for each over those. Right. So what we need to do now, or naively, it would seem that the only thing we need to do is to snap the transforms, right? But again, we need to keep in mind that undo is going to be a factor here. So if we just do gameObject.transform, I guess we need their position first. So that would be gameObject.transform.position, and then we need to snap them. Heck. This is tedious. I wish this was shader code, then we could just do round on a position, but actually, let's make an extension method. If you've never used extension methods before, they are incredibly useful, and I highly recommend using those. So in this case, I wanted to round a vector 3, right? That's kind of how you snap things to integers. And doing this every time is kind of like boilerplatey and frustrating. But there's a thing in C# where you can sort of add methods to existing classes. And that's called an extension method. So in order to write one, it needs to be in a static class, and it needs to be a static function. And the first parameter should be this, and then the type that you want to add the extension to. And that could be called anything. I usually just call it v. And then you can do the whatever code you want to do. In this case, we're going to use v, and then return v. So now we made an extension method. So instead of doing like all of this boilerplate garbage, we can now do go.transform.position.round. So now this round method, quote unquote, exists within the vector3 type, right? So now we can sort of like shove all of that boilerplate elsewhere, which is super neat. Yeah, I tend to use extension methods a lot. Probably too much. Yeah. Okay, so basically now we are iterating through your selection, and for every game object we have selected, we snap its transform to a rounded position, right? Because we set the position to the snapped version of its current position, in world space in this case. I wonder if I can show this practically. I probably can. Okay, I can probably show you how this goes wrong, hopefully. Otherwise, or maybe Unity is going to be weird and not work the way I expect it to, which sometimes happens. All right, so now we have all of these objects, right? You can see that none of these have snapped positions. Well, on the y-axis they do, but otherwise they're all like decimal points, right? So now we should be able to select all of these and then snap all of them, right? So go to edit and the snap selected objects. All of them snapped into place, right? You can see that they toggled into a new location. And if we look at them, they have a new position now, right? Okay, so that seems it's all fine, well, right? Let's move them around a bit. So now they're not snapped anymore. So if we now save the scene, you can see that there's no asterisk up here anymore because the scene is saved. If I move something, there's a little asterisk here that tells you that the scene has changed, right? So if I undo that movement, it goes back to unchanged. If I now select all of the objects and press snap selected objects, that asterisk did not appear. And this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying that it's not being flagged as dirty. Like, we're making changes, but the scene doesn't recognize that we're making changes because we're just making changes to the non-serialized data, but not the serialized data. And that's kind of a dangerous thing that can really mess you up, especially if you're writing like really big editor tools. So be very careful about like how serialized data works and make sure to test all of these things. So now if I like make a new scene and then go back to the sample scene, then these are not snapped anymore, even though we snapped them, right? Yeah. So that's why we need to be like, I'm more careful with how we do these types of things. We can't just naively do things and expect them to work the way that, you know, our users would expect them to work. All right, so what we need to do here is that we need to mark these, we need to mark them for a change, right? So quite often I make a constant for whatever I want to call the undo. So this is, again, this is going to be the undo string that pops up here when it says undo blah, blah, blah. And that blah, blah, blah is this part, right? So we wanted to say like undo snap objects or something. Or redo, because redo is also going to work if you're using the undo system. So now we need to mark things as record them for the undo, right? And again, you need to record before you move them, not after. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So in this case, we need to do undo.recordObjects. And you also need to be specific, because remember that this one takes a single Unity object, right? But if we look at this object right here, this is not a single Unity engine.object, right? This is a game object, it's a transform, it's a mesh filter, it's a mesh renderer, and it's an explosive barrel script, right? These are all separate objects. So whenever you mark things for undo, if you mark the game object, that's only going to mark things for changing when it comes to adding or removing components, when it comes to the tags, when it comes to the layer, when it comes to the name of it, when it comes to its static flags, but nothing else. Like, all of the stuff outside of that belongs to the other components, right? So in this case, the thing we want to record is the transform component specifically, right? Because we're not changing the name of these objects or anything. It's just the transform that we're changing. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that make sure you undo record only the specific things you're changing. All right, so also if you do like mass editing of stuff, undo recording is very much not free. So if you have a massive scene with like thousands of objects, which we did when we worked on budget cuts at NeedCorp, then having a script that quote unquote only iterates through the objects and does one thing, undo recording all of those objects is a very like slow process. So again, make sure that you do this only when you need to and only on the very things that you're going to edit, right? Because Unity has to do a bunch of shenanigans in order to, you know, cache that undo state and do diffs and all of that stuff, right? Yeah, and then we want to use this undo string, right? Because this is what we wanted to say when you undo. All right, so we're recording specifically this transform, then we're editing that transform, and then we're doing that for every single object. All right, so now if we go back to Unity, then let's try this again. So we can go to snap selected objects. That's the thing we were creating, right? Now if we click that one, we get the asterisk there, right? Now the scene is actually marked as changed. And if we go to edit, now it says undo snap objects. So now if I press Control Z, then it actually does undo that. And I can also redo that with Control Y. So now you can see that we have these two undo states, and even the scene now properly recognizes everything has changed, right? How do you create a hotkey for a menu item? So to make a hotkey, you add that to the end of this string. I think the specific syntax has to be space and then the symbols you want, and then whatever hotkey you want to use for snapping, right? I think they're represented using like various symbols that I always forget. One of them is Shift, one of them is Alt, and one of them is Control. It's in the Unity menu item documentation. So if we go here, yeah, okay, so percentage is Control, a hash is Shift, and an ampersand is Alt. So what would we use for snapping? I don't know, Control Shift S is already taken. Control Alt S maybe? I don't know. So that would be percentage ampersand. Might not actually work because the scene view might eat up that alt. So let's go back to Unity. So now it says Control Alt S. So let's see if that works. Select those, and that does work. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, that's how you do the things. There are like other things you can do in case you want to make the, like, it doesn't really matter in this case, but like if you want to make the snap selected objects be grayed out, as in you can't click it if you don't have anything selected, you can make a validation function if you want. So there's a parameter here called isValidate function. I want to set that one to true in this case. So then this one is going to return a bool for whether or not you can use this thing, right? So in this case, we would just do selection.gameObjects dot length is greater than 0, meaning you have something selected, right? Pretty sure that's how you do it. I almost never make validation functions. Now it's grayed out, and if I select something, it's now possible to click it, right? Yeah. That's how you would do that. If you want, you could make it more advanced. Like, if they're already snapped, maybe you can't click it either, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Was that clear? How the thing worked? Pretty sure it matches based on this string. I don't think it's using the name of the function. So as long as these two have the exact same string, one of them is marked as isValidate function, then everything should work as expected. Is there a way to put this menu item into a custom menu? Like instead of directly into edit, it should go into edit custom tools. Yes. So this is a string. You could make this any string you want. You know, you could call it my things slash smiley face slash beep, and now you have a path, right? So we go back to Unity. Wait, what was the path? Maybe it's sad about the smiley. Was I not allowed to do that? This is the wrong Unity project, that's why. I want the smiley face back. There we go. My thing, smiley face, beep, and then your snap thing. So you can like put it wherever you want. So I think what we're going to do for the rest of today, I'm going to talk about how to make an editor window. Then I think we have enough so that I can give you an exercise, if you'd be up for doing that. Spinning that coordinate system is making me dizzy. Sorry, I like fiddling with my gizmos. They're good. That can be taken out of context, but you know what? That's okay. I own that statement. Maybe I do like to fiddle with my gizmos. Cool. So we got one more thing that that's kind of very central to when you're making any kind of editor scripts. And that is the editor window. And we haven't talked about that. I only showed you a few things that were made using editor windows. Like ShaderForge was a thing that you opened, and then it had a lot of UI elements in it and a lot of functionality, right? So we're going to make one of those. We're going to make an editor window. And an editor window is basically the core component that is in all of the dockable windows in Unity, right? Like the inspector itself is an editor window. The console is an editor window. All of this stuff is editor windows. So what we're going to do is that we're going to create another one of those and add some functionality to that. So yeah, let's go ahead and create a script. Now I forget, is there any? Okay, yeah. So we're gonna do this. Already named the other one Snapper. That's not good. So let's call it Snapper Tool or something. I don't know. That's the name of this one now. Right. So it's an editor script, so you should put it in an editor folder as usual. And then the next step now is that we need to first make this an editor window, because right now it's a model behavior, which is not what we want. We want an editor window. And so now we have kind of the basics of setting up that. So we're inheriting from editor windows. Now we have all of that functionality, but there's no way for us to open this window. Like how do you get the window, right? The way you would usually open windows is so you would add another menu item, right? And maybe you put it under tools and snapper tool or whatever you want to call it, right? And then you want to make this a, wait, did I, no. Public static void. Call it whatever you want. And then what we want to do in this function is that we want to call getWindow with our type in it. Generally, this kind of depends on how you want to set things up. If you have a tool where you're supposed to be able to open multiple windows, then you're going to want to do this differently. There's probably create window or something. I never make those types of tools, but get window will basically make it so that when you press this button in Tool Snapper, if there's no window, it will create it and then focus it. If a window already exists, it will focus the window. So this is kind of, whenever you make a tool that is only supposed to have a single window open, this is how you would do that, right? It's a little boilerplate, but yeah. All right, so now if we go to tools, we have Snapper, and if we click that, we now get our Snapper tool. And there we go. Although, I kind of want to change the title. Is the title here? Yeah, cool. There we go. The title had the full class name on it like that. Let's close that. There we go. All right, so now we've created our own editor window, and it does absolutely nothing right now. It's completely empty, but we have all the functionality we would expect. We can dock it, we can put it side by side and vertically and all of that stuff. So that's neat. And one thing about editor windows is that they're also saved in your layout. So if you leave Unity and come back, it's going to open when you're coming back, right? It probably sounds obvious in hindsight because all the other windows behave this way, but sometimes you actually code things in a way where you expect things to have been initialized in a specific way, where you might not expect your window to pop up immediately when you reopen Unity. So it's a good thing to keep in mind sometimes. Okay. All right. So what can we do here? Well, we can do a very similar thing as we did with the custom inspectors, right? We can add our UI function to draw UI in this. And I think it's on GUI. Let's do a label just to make sure. So now we got a label in on GUI. So if we go back here, we now have a little label right there. So now this is where we can start doing interesting things, right? This is where we can do stuff like, you know, if GUI layout dot button, and we might call that snap or snap selection. Then here we want to do the same thing that we did with the snapper hotkey, right? So if we go back to the hotkey, then we basically want to do this whole thing. And then we want the undo string as well. Don't really have to have a variable. Doesn't matter. Who cares? Let's just put them all over our code. Right, and then the extension method is currently private. There we go. So now we have a button for snapping our selection. Isn't that super neat? Let's rotate all these objects and then press snap selection and then undo, snap, undo. Yeah. So now we just made an editor window that has a bunch of features like this, right? All right. So one more thing that we might want to do is that we had a validation function in this one where you could only snap if you have stuff selected, right? So we probably want to do a similar thing in this thing where, excuse me, where you probably shouldn't be able to press it if you don't have anything selected, right? So a very useful UI utility actually is something called a disabled scope, or similar to begin horizontal and begin vertical. You can do a similar thing, but for disabling all of the UI elements within a given scope. So first off, we might want to make a function out of this, just to clean it up a little. There we go. And then there's a thing in, if we go to using, new, editor, GUI layout, dot, editor GUI, dot disabled scope, because again, editor GUI contains things that can be, that's not specifically for layout stuff, but could be for anything, right? So that's why it wasn't in layout. All right, so now we have a disabled scope, and then we need to specify whether or not it should be disabled. And it should be disabled if selection.GameObjects.count, or length, equals 0. So now everything within this scope is going to be disabled in case you don't have anything selected. There you go. So now you can see that the snap selection is grayed out, but if I select some stuff, it's now filled in, right? There is one caveat though, which you probably don't have to care about, but I usually care a lot about that, is that you might be able to tell that even if I select something, it didn't enable itself now until I move my cursor over it, and then it enables, right? And this is because the UI stuff like windows and even the scene view doesn't actually repaint every frame. They only repaint when you interact with them and when they expect to have something changed, right? So I'm pretty sure there's a callback for selection changed. Yes. Cool. So we can use that. So now if we go to onEnable, and onEnable and onDisable work kind of like you expect them to. They're going to be called for the editor windows, just like they are for game objects. So now we want to make it so that every time you change your selection, we want to repaint the UI, right? So in this case, we can use a function called repaint, and that's specifically for the UI. Which is going to be telling Unity that we need to update the UI right now. So what we can do is that we can go to selection dot selection changed plus equals, because this is a delegate, so we can sign up for this event. So then we add repaint to that one. And then we do another one, which is on disable, and then we unsubscribe from that event. And speaking of like patterns in Unity, this is another one of those like really useful patterns when it comes to delegates. Subscribing in onEnable and unsubscribing in onDisable is super reliable and doesn't give you any trouble. It's really, really useful. Because it works as you expect. In case you dock the window or hide the window or close the window, reopen a new window, all of this is going to work the way you want it to. So now the repaint function is going to be called every time the selection is changed. So now it's now enabled, and if I deselect it, it's disabled immediately. So now it's actually responding to everything we're doing, right? And for me personally, as a tool developer, this matters a lot to me. So I tend to probably spend way too much time making sure that things are responsive, even if it's not in a game. But yeah, it's a useful thing to know. You might need to use a repaint in other circumstances as well. We're definitely going to use it tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. Let's see, there was one more thing I should go through before I give you the assignment. Any questions so far, by the way? Have you used delegates and events and stuff? I presume you are familiar with this? Yes. Last course we used this. Gotcha. They're super useful. So Unity has a bunch of built-in ones like that. For instance, there's a like editor application dot update. This is like the editor update loop, which runs at like 100 frames per second or so. So if you want to do something every frame, then you can do that too. You can sign up for the update loop of the editor using editor application dot update. There's also stuff you can do with the scene view, which we're going to do a lot tomorrow, but I can show you a quick example of that as well. So now we're going to have to make these sad. I like my expression bodied members, and now it's not. So there's another one. Scene view. There's one called during scene GUI, and this one is pretty useful. So you can make a function for that, like void during scene GUI, and I'm pretty sure it has a scene view parameter. Because again, Unity can have multiple scene views, so this one is going to be called for every scene view that you have open. So we can sign up to the during scene GUI with our during scene GUI function, and then unsubscribe as well. Wait, why are these different? Why do these have different color? I'm confused. Anyway, Alright, so now we have a function that is going to be called for the scene view. And in here, we can actually use our handles function. So we can do handles dot draw line from vector3.0 to vector3 dot up. So now the snapper window is drawing this line right here, this white little vertical line. So you can use these events to even draw stuff in the scene view. And again, we're going to do a lot of this tomorrow with the big tool we're making. But you're also going to use this today. The kind of what we did now is that we just made this one window where you could select objects and then press one button to snap those objects, right? But there's not really it's very simplistic and it's not really very flexible, right? So there are two separate assignments that you can do depending on like what you think fits your skill level or what you think you would learn by doing. So let's go with the first one. The first one is the slightly simpler one. So right now it kind of snaps to a grid with a fixed size, right? It's specifically 1 meter snapping for this distance, right? And now Photoshop just completely died, as it does sometimes. Thanks. Cool, thanks Photoshop. So right now they were always like snapping to 1 meter, right? So what I would like you to do is add a property where you can actually change the granularity of the snapping, so that you can set it to, maybe it would snap to the 0.5 or maybe 0.25 or even larger grid units, like you go to 2 or 4 or whatever. So you could actually change the size of the snapping. And this should then also be part of that UI. So currently the UI just has this single button, but it would be neat to see if you can set the actual size of this one. So one would be to set grid size or scale, whatever you want to call it. So that would be one part of the first one. And then the second thing would be to, okay, if somebody knows why Photoshop does this sometimes, please let me know. It kills a document where I can no longer interact with it, but I can save it and I can close it and I can reopen it and everything's fine. I'm so confused. Okay, so set the grid size and scale, and then the right. And then the other thing would be to draw it, to actually show this in the scene view. Because right now you can't see the grid that it's snapping to. So like it's really hard to tell like what it's actually doing, right? And it doesn't have to be like a very advanced script that can draw the grid view like forever. If you want to like simplify it, you can just draw it near the origin. I don't need to have like vertical lines or whatever. It could be a flat 2D grid like this, but just some way of being able to visualize the grid snapping that we're going to do, right? If you want to get fancy about it, you could show the grid around the objects that you're snapping, or even show where the object's going to move to. But basically, the idea would be to show the grid. Okay. So this would kind of be like step one of the most simple way to expand the script. The other thing, now it's doing it again. Why does this happen? Usually it doesn't happen this much. Now I'm like concerned. Is my computer even running now? What in the world just happened? Okay. I'm sorry. I don't know why this happens extremely frequently now. Okay, stream's still working and everything's fine, right? Yeah, okay. I think this is just my main computer that's getting messed up. Oh, hello, Thor. Okay, okay. If you want to jump, jump. Thor. Trying to give an assignment here. Jeez. Okay, Beast. Hi. I very much appreciate you, Thor. Please don't step on my keyboard. Nope, nope. Okay, okay. Okay. Thanks, Thor. I'm gonna have to cuddle Thor so much after this. He's been very sad today. Right, that would be the first assignment. Was that clear, by the way? Let me know if I'm being unclear. I don't know if I'm like... I'm probably presuming that you know a bunch of things that you might not know of, so let me know if there's anything you want me to like clarify. Okay, actually let's number these. 1, 2. Cool. 3. The third thing is, we could have a fourth thing as well. How many things do you want me to stack? Should I just like slap them in? Because there are a bunch of things we could add. Actually, I'm just going to do all of them, and you can like pick whichever ones you want to do. So number 3 would be to add support for a stable Photoshop, please. Can you add that? All right, add support for a polar grid. Can you type out the assignments as well? Yes, I'm going to send you this picture afterwards. So add support for polar grid, and this means that instead of only having support for the Cartesian coordinates, kind of like the standard grid usually does, you would also have a polar coordinate, which means that you're going to have angular and radial units. And you can presume that you're just going to use the origin of the world. That's fine. So then instead you're going to want to snap to these coordinates right here. So instead of snapping to these corners, it's going to snap to these corners right here. So then the grid size scale would mean that we would also need an angular scale, right? So then you would have a separate radial scale or size and an angular size. Okay. Cool. How does that sound? There's one more thing I could do. Actually, let's do that. And the fourth one is going to be a bit of an adventure because I haven't talked about how to do that stuff. So I'm curious if you'd be able to implement it. So the fourth one would be to make the grid, oh geez. There we go. Make the grid settings persist between Unity sessions, which means if you close Unity and open Unity, they should keep the grid settings that you had last time. That would be neat. I think I'm intentionally not going to tell you how to do that, because then you're going to train your Google foo about figuring that out. Yeah. I think that would be neat. And if you ever get stuck on it, feel free to ask. I'm going to stick around for all the time we have left. How much time do we have left? What is time? I can't trust my things when I read time anymore. It's the wrong window. I also need to spend some time cuddling with Thor. 2 hours left. Okay, perfect. Will you show us your solution tomorrow? Yeah, sure. We could do that. This is going to involve a lot of stuff we talked about during our math class. Isn't that neat? How it's like the math thing and this editor coding thing are like intersecting. And now we got, it's a whole Venn diagram. Hey. I feel like Thor has questions. Hey, buddy. Oh, could you explain number one? Being able to set the grid size. Like how big should a single unit, a grid unit be, right? Thor, don't scratch the streaming computer. Because right now it snaps to 1 meter, but you should be able to set a number where you can tell it to snap to every second meter, or every third meter, or every half meter, and so forth, right? Yeah. Oh, the more advanced one that I was going to suggest is that you would be able to place grids in the scene, and then you can snap objects to those grids. Rather than just having one grid in that editor window, you would have localized grids in various places in the scene view, and then you would be able to snap to those. That's the actual thing that we had use for when working on budget cuts, where I wrote a tool to do exactly that. So I figured it might be useful to make something like that, but it's also a little bit of a weird middle ground of there's data in objects in the scene, but also it's a bit of an editor script. So, but yeah, if you want, you can set that up as well. But it's a bit more advanced and involves weird shenanigans. But it's up to you. The current thing is definitely probably good enough to just do on your own. And yeah, as usual, it's probably good to try to do things on your own as much as you can, and then only ask people for help if you're truly stuck. I think that would be a really good way to make sure that you actually learn and fundamentally understand the things we've gone through. Otherwise, if you just do the things people tell you, you haven't actually learned anything. And I'm not going to grade this assignment, and I just don't care at all how, if you hand it in or whatever. I care about you learning the things that you want to learn, and I just want to help you do that, right? That's my goal. And yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So if you copy someone else's work just to rush to the finish line with an assignment, that's entirely pointless, because I don't care about the final results. I care about you learning the things that you should learn, and the things that you find useful, right? Yeah, anyway, that's my rant, I guess. Cool. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope this was useful, especially for the students, but also for all of you on Twitch. Yeah, also big thanks to Future Games for allowing me to stream this. It's really, really nice of them. Yeah, so super big thanks to Future Games, because they're paying me as a teacher, but they're also okay with me having all of this being public for people, which is really, really nice of Future Games. So yeah, big up for Future Games. Yeah, it's also really good education. So if you want to learn game dev and you're in Stockholm or Sweden, then Future Games is a really, really good place for that. So definitely go check out their stuff in case you're interested in applying for a game dev school. Not sure how many of you are in Sweden, but yeah. I went to Future Games in 2010. So, and that got me places. So it's good. That's a correlation right there. If you want to join the Discord for this stream, and my streaming, my game dev streaming, all of my stuff, then feel free to join my Discord. We're a community of overlapping between the game developers and LGBT communities, sort of very much overlap, and then a bunch of other people as well. You're welcome, regardless if you're a game developer and regardless if you're under the LGBT umbrella. You're welcome. Unless you're a Nazi, Nazis are not welcome. So there's a little caveat there for you Nazis watching. But yeah, feel free to join. And then, as usual, I have my Twitter where I post my math animation stuff, in case you're interested in that, or general shitposting and game dev stuff. And my YouTube, where I have a bunch of tutorials about how to make shaders in Unity, how to do math, and all of the things you need to be a game developer that does those things. Yeah, I think that's all of my plugs. But yeah, otherwise, thank you all so much for joining. This might make it to YouTube. Depends on what Future Games is saying. I think they're going to be fine with it, but it might not, but maybe. We'll see. But yeah, have a good day, evening, wherever you happen to be. and thank you so much for joining.